The samurai fought alongside heroes, slayed the demon king, and returned home at last. But Japan had changed, ruined cities, endless swarms of zombies, and humanity on the edge of collapse. Armed with the skills of another world, Azami carves a path through the apocalypse. Yet every time he saves others, fear follows. Every act of justice makes him a monster in their eyes. All that remains is the blade in his hand and the path ahead. Will his lonely road end in salvation? Or in silence? Let's find out. The story began with Yanagi Azami, the protagonist, slaying zombies and thinking he needed to hold out a little longer until that child was completely safe. Kade sat next to him. He continued slaying all the monsters until morning came. Looking at the piles of corpses, the protagonist noted that now that the place was tidied up, he could slowly move on from here. At least someone might find the power he brought with him from there useful. A little earlier, in the holy city of Ansem, near the gate to another world, Iris, a holy half-elf, anxiously asked if he really needed to go. Even once he went there, returning to the kingdom was impossible. Standing next to her were Gentiana, the hero, and Lobelia, the great sage, a dark elf. MC replied that he would tell them right away. He liked them all, but he was fed up with this world. He reflected that 3 years had passed since he came to this world. He spent most of his time as a member of a group of heroes, their journey ending with their victory over the Demon King. However, despite everyone wishing for victory over the Demon King, those same people constantly threw a spanner in their works. They barely had time to rest from one incident before another occurred. The king of that world said that with heroes like them, he and their country were safe. Everyone looked at them askance, wondering if they could trust a dark elf and an alien from another world. In another dimension, a man told them they should disappear, since the Demon King was their country's business partner. After that, MC said that in this world, he had experienced the cycle of human malice. There was nothing he could do about it. At least he wanted to say goodbye to them on a good note. Let them accept his parting gift. It wasn't for nothing that he kept it in his subspace. He left his sword with Gentiana. In the world he was heading to, these wouldn't be of any use anyway. A watch for Iris, and a tie and a pin for Lobelia. Let them take these. He hoped these were good gifts. Gentiana happily agreed and thanked him. Iris, upset, said that she was very happy. She would cherish this for the rest of her life. Lobelia, smiling, noted that this meant he hadn't forgotten when she said she was interested in things from his world. MC, smiling, replied that these were just boring gifts from a boring old man. He wouldn't be offended if they didn't like it. She said that he wouldn't disappear anywhere, of course, but he should behave well there. The protagonist agreed and replied that they should take care of themselves too. Gentiana tearfully exclaimed that they were truly grateful to him for everything. Iris began to cry and agreed with her. Lobelia, smiling, said that they would see each other again. Sometime later, while in the room, he noticed that the last time he was here was 3 years ago. He felt a strong sense of nostalgia. He had returned to this world. The protagonist looked at the calendar and, seeing April 20th, was surprised to think that he had entered another world somewhere around the end of March. So about a month had passed here. Lobelia had said that even though he had spent 3 years here, once he passed through the gate, he would return to this world practically at the moment of his disappearance. Well, a month was better than 3 years. What had happened here during the month of his absence? Work, or rather, what had happened to his life. His phone had died, quite naturally. He had been gone for a month. As soon as he charged it, he needed to call everyone. He looked in the mirror and thought that if he went outside like this, the police would immediately catch him. His stomach was empty and he was thirsty. He needed to get some rest. MC put on his shirt and, seeing a ring on his thumb, noticed that it was the ring that opened the subspace. Now he can't use it. Suddenly, he did use it and a magical space appeared. The protagonist was surprised that it had opened. This space can store items for a long time, and it's always at hand. What would happen if he used it in this world? It still seemed to work. Well, if he didn't overuse it, it was just a convenient thing. Wait, if the ring worked as before, then he picked up a coffee can and thought that the average person would have a hard time even bending it. The protagonist applied a little force and bent the can with ease. He thought it was like bending a piece of paper. He would check a few more things later. These forces could become a hindrance to his future peaceful life. MC looked at his phone and, seeing that it wasn't charging, wondered in surprise if there had been a power outage. He looked in the refrigerator and thought that the refrigerator hadn't worked either, and hadn't for a long time. Had his electricity been cut off for non-payment? Well, nothing could be done. Okay, he could charge his phone with a portable charger. Maybe he should go to the store for groceries? The protagonist walked out into the entryway and, seeing so much dirt, wondered in surprise where all this dirt had come from. They hadn't exactly kept it clean before, but was that rust or slush? More like blood, though. He looked to the side and spotted a zombie starting to walk toward him. In complete shock, the protagonist asked, "Is this some kind of prank?" He thought to himself, no, it wasn't a fake. He was sure of it. He'd often encountered the undead in that world. Damn, he'd think about that later. Now he needed to run to the first floor. He ran to the stairs and thought that, come to think of it, zombies were pretty unkillable, but maybe he was wrong after all. The MC went down to the first floor and, seeing a dead man with a bat lying next to him, thought there was no mistake. He armed himself with the bat and went outside, where hordes of zombies were already roaming. The protagonist closed the door in horror and wondered what was going on here. Was this really his original world? Was he really back in Japan? This was definitely his apartment and his bedroom. Nothing had changed at all since his disappearance. He hit the zombie with the bat and hid in his apartment, and then wondered what had happened here this month. The protagonist picked up his phone and wondered if it had charged. He had 110 missed calls, a ton of messages on email and social media. Was there even a letter from a junior colleague at work? The text message said, "Did he decide to go for a walk today? By the way, doesn't he find this video creepy?" The MC noted that it was a rather lighthearted message, sent 5 days after he was transported to another world. That creepy video was real. Is he safe there? Bandits are operating in their city. There was an extremist attack at the station. Was he hurt? These are the same messages from countless people. Now it all becomes clear to him. The world began to change that day. There's no information on his phone about what started it all. Oh well, he supposes it only took a few days for phone service across Japan to be completely unusable. He read a colleague's message saying he's heading to City Hall. They're evacuating survivors there. He hopes he's also safe. The protagonist thought about the evacuation zone the younger man mentioned, City Hall, being 2 subway stops away. Judging by his messages, this guy had been holed up inside his apartment for a long time without food supplies. He supposes he had little choice. Maybe he should go to City Hall first? He quickly packed his backpack and listed the clothes, food, and medicine in it. He actually wanted to put everything he could still use in the subspace, but maybe he should put some in his backpack for camouflage? The problem was that the water had been cut off too. He hoped he could stock up on water somewhere. At that moment, the zombie remaining in the entrance started pounding on his door. The protagonist picked up a bat and said he'd be right out. He kicked the door open with incredible force, and pushing the zombie into the wall, said that now that he knew what this world had become, he wouldn't hold back any longer. MC, with a serious expression, noted that it looked like he could pour mana into the bat, just like in another world. He remembered Gentiana admiringly saying that samurai was a unique class that only those from another world could master. It was an amazing class whose attacks were based on melee sword techniques. Iris said that her and Lobelia's mana was used for spells, but he couldn't do that. But he can enhance his basic physical stats with mana. Lobelia herself added that he can enhance an item's stats. This will work on any object as long as he touches it with his own hands. Let him strive to master this perfectly. Well, his head is probably a mess right now thanks to all these classes and magic, but if he doesn't understand something, he can feel free to ask. Iris said with a smile that she hoped they could help him learn a lot. Currently, the protagonist delivered a powerful blow with the bat and, having pierced the zombie's head, wondered if he'd actually planned to cut off its head. Was the bat slightly dented? Was it because of the weak mana conductivity? He had no choice. He'd have to learn a lot. So he needed to search everything from the 5th floor to the 1st. MC scanned the entire building and, upon discovering zombies, reflected on the fact that the always ready for battle skill allowed him to detect hostile creatures and any other signs of danger. He hadn't noticed this before because he had deliberately dulled the senses honed in another world, but it seemed he could still use it. It was the same as with the subspace magical enhancement. Thanks to this skill, he would now always be able to sense the approach of zombies and, along with them, any survivors. He searched all 5 floors, but throughout the entire building, he could only sense the presence of zombies. Ultimately, there weren't a single survivor here. For now, all he could say was that the always ready for battle skill was working as intended. It might be a bit of a letdown, but it was still effective, right? After a while, he went outside and reflected on how he needed to get to City Hall while avoiding unnecessary encounters with zombies. And to do that, he'd have to take the alleys instead of the main road. Of course, he can get by without unnecessary caution, but something about his new life in this world worries him. If survivors see him fighting a horde of zombies, what will they think? Civilians, police, and self-defense forces, government members? It doesn't matter who sees it, because one way or another, it will turn into a problem. The protagonist, with a serious face, cut off a zombie's head with one blow and thought that now, at least, Japan is on the brink of destruction. He hasn't seen a single survivor yet. He wonders if any government members are still alive. It would be sad if he were left alone with zombies in this world. Looking at his broken bat, he noted that it was useless now. The protagonist continued walking and thought that he would have to make a short detour to the City Hall, but he was sure that was where it was, so why not go? Sometime later, he came to a department store and thought that he needed a durable weapon. He thinks he can stock up on a crowbar and a handsaw there. In zombie movies, such places are often used as barricaded shelters. He thinks there might be survivors there, although it seems his expectations were dashed. MC sneaked inside and, looking at the huge crowds of zombies, he thought that breaking through to the front entrance was a bad idea, so he came in through the side entrance, but there are an awful lot of them here too. Let them forgive him, but he'd prefer to shop alone. The protagonist, with a serious face, charged the bat with magic and began to destroy all the zombies. Having cleared the building, he noticed that his night vision skill seemed to be working too. He thinks he can now take a leisurely look around. The protagonist came to a camping goods boutique and thought that it was an impressive camping spot. There's a lot of that water here. He packed everything into the subspace and realized his subspace could hold about 1,000 kilograms. Not as impressive as it seemed. He wouldn't always be able to replenish his food and water supplies, so he'd have to consume the bare minimum daily. An adult needs 2 liters of water per day, with an active lifestyle requiring 4 to 5 liters. Rations were 3 servings per day, 1.5 to 2 kilograms each. He couldn't let his guard down in this unpredictable world. He'd have to leave a lot of supplies behind, which was a shame. If the hero's entire squad had been here, they would have carried everything away. Next came the second floor. MC went up and, finding himself in the toolbox, found a crowbar. He thought it would be stronger than a baseball bat. Maybe he should take more of these for backup? Now he had a new weapon too. There was nothing else to do on the second floor. Suddenly he scanned the area again and noticed a creature on the third floor. The protagonist was surprised to find that it didn't look like a zombie. The response was so weak. Was it a survivor? And right next to him was another one, a zombie this time. He instantly rushed up to the third floor. Jumping over the barricade, the protagonist arrived at the staff room. He opened the door and thought about the living aura emanating from that room. MC entered one of the rooms and asked if anyone was there. Kade was lying on the floor in that room. He approached her and asked if he assumed she'd been locked in here for a while and was hungry, right? She asked in shock, "Is he alive?" MC raised his hands and replied that the blood on his clothes wasn't his. As far as she could see, he was alive. The girl excitedly apologized and asked if he'd come in response to the distress call. He replied no, he was just passing by. Oh well, would she eat? He had water too? Kade asked in surprise if she could really. After a while, she began to eat greedily, tears in her eyes. The girl sheepishly said she apologized for attacking the food so greedily. It's just that she'd been here for 3 days and hadn't eaten anything. The protagonist told her to relax and eat slowly. She asked how things were outside. He replied that zombies were roaming everywhere. Kade said she was grateful for him sharing his food with her. Was there anything she could do for him? The protagonist, with a calm face, replied that there was no need. She noted with surprise that food was worth its weight in gold these days. It would take some effort just to find it. No one would give away their food for nothing. He replied that he truly didn't need anything. Kade said that, and yet, if it weren't for him, she wouldn't have had a chance of survival. She would either have starved to death or been killed by the monsters outside the door. Uncle, no older brother, was her savior. MC was puzzled, wondering if she just wanted to say, "Uncle?" It wasn't that he was denying that he was old enough to be her uncle, but still. He'd introduced himself and said he was 35, so he was more of an uncle than an older brother, but she could just call him a zombie. The girl responded excitedly. How could she? Right, she hadn't introduced herself. Her name was Kade, and she was a first-year high school student. He could just call her by her first name. He smiled and thought that he really was old enough to be her father. He'd corrected her for a reason. Kade asked why he was smiling, and why had he said he was 35 so hesitantly. MC thought he couldn't tell her that he didn't know whether to add the 3 years he'd spent in another world to his age. He should change the subject. He replied that his age wasn't important right now. He was smiling because he thought it was funny that she was so concerned about formalities at her age. She excitedly asked if there was any way she could thank him. The protagonist thought she was trying to be polite and at least repay him for the food. She certainly wasn't bad. He thought she could safely be called a good child. He replied that he had 2 requests. 1, let her take care of herself. He doesn't know what she was thinking, but no, it was more likely that he was overthinking it. Whatever the case, his request had no subtext. Kade blushed deeply and replied that she understood him. The protagonist added that the second request was that she might not want to answer his question, but he had to ask. How did she end up here, and what happened? How did the situation come to this? He would like to hear any details from her. The girl replied that she would tell him everything. It all started with a video that went viral. The news was abuzz with speculation about whether it was real or fake, experiments with a zombie virus, and people go crazy immediately after being injected. The video was sent by a hacker from an unknown country. No comments have been released yet. No signs of editing have been found. People are panicking, and conspiracy theories are gaining popularity. Kade continued that a couple of days later, in the middle of the night, everyone received an evacuation order, and she and her parents headed to school, which was designated as one of the safe zones. On the way there, her mother was bitten by an infected person. By then, they were already wandering the streets in droves, so they decided to leave school and go to the nearest department store, where her father was the manager. But when they started running low on food, her father decided to go down alone to get it. That was the last time she saw him, and so she was left there alone. She'd thought it was all over many times, but before he left, her father had asked her to survive no matter what. MC wondered if that was what had happened to her and her family. She was clearly struggling to hold back her tears. She continued to tell the story, despite wanting to stop. Fear, despair, and the loss of loved ones, and he made her remember it all. These were truly unpleasant memories. He apologized to her with a serious expression. Kade replied that he had nothing to apologize for. The protagonist dumped his supplies from his backpack on the floor and told her to eat as much as she wanted. The equipment was also at her disposal. Just be careful with fire and don't make too much noise. These zombies have good hearing. She asked in surprise, could she really use it? He agreed and added that she shouldn't be shy. He had already decided that he would help her. The protagonist thought that the situation in the world was more or less clear. There are survivors, that's good. And besides the mayor's office, there's another evacuation point, the school. And he learned all this thanks to her. Kade thanked him again excitedly and added that if he needed anything, he should just tell her. He replied that as he said, everything was fine. MC, with a serious expression, thought that her words were the result of her father's request, which she took to heart, to survive at any cost, the request of her father, who never returned. He said that he had to tell her one thing. The girl excitedly replied that she was listening. The protagonist thought that what he was about to tell her might hurt her, but he had to do it. He explained that on the way here, he killed all the zombies he encountered. All the zombies on the first floor were dead. Most likely her father was among them. Those who became zombies cannot be saved. They are already dead. Finishing them off by crushing their skulls, one could say that it was mercy. And he was going to kill what was left of her mother. Kade, utterly horrified, replied that she understood. The protagonist considered what she said about her mother being bitten and feeling zombies on the third floor. In other words, she was there. He decided he would help her. And to do so, he had to get rid of any threat. The girl gave him the keys to the locker room and said her mother was second door down. She stood up and followed him. MC, armed with a crowbar, asked if she had decided to come with him. Kade worriedly asked if she couldn't. He replied that that wasn't what he meant. Maybe it would be even better if she saw everything for herself. The protagonist thought she should face the truth. If he was going to help her, then this would be the best outcome. As they walked to the right room, she began to recall all the moments with her father and mother. In her memories, Kade wondered what kind of video it was. Her father replied with a smile that he doubted it was fake. The blood looked too real. Her mother exclaimed, "They should stop. You shouldn't talk about things like that over food." In another memory, when the mother was bitten, she said, "What will happen to them now? They should lock her in the locker room and barricade the door with some furniture, just in case." She's afraid she might go crazy and do the same to her daughter. After they locked her in, the father apologized and said that her mother was so weak. In the present, they approached the locker room. The furious screams of zombies could be heard from within the room. The MC, with a serious face, said that he had removed all the barricades and that it was time to open the door. He inserted the key into the lock and told her to step aside. After that, the protagonist opened the door and delivered a powerful blow, which sent the zombie mother flying into the wall. Kade, seeing this, remembered her father asking, "Hasn't she realized yet?" Her mother was dead, and what was behind that door was something entirely different. The protagonist, his expression calm, reflected on how well preserved she was compared to the others. Without the scar on her arm, she could be mistaken for a slightly ill woman, but a closer look revealed that she was no longer human. She had clearly become something entirely different. Kade called out to her in utter terror. He asked if she had finished saying goodbye. MC instantly ran up to the zombie and delivered a finishing blow to the head. As she fell, he finished her off with a powerful blow to the head. The protagonist warned her to remain vigilant. Just because a zombie fell didn't mean it was dead, but with such a head injury, she definitely couldn't have survived. The girl, horrified, burst into tears. He thought to himself that her eyes were saying, it shouldn't have come to this. In fact, he had killed her mother with the first blow. He had only dealt the second blow so that she would learn to be more careful around zombies. He didn't care whether she hated him or not, because he had already decided that he would help her. It was necessary. No matter who the zombie was in life, she had to kill it. This was especially true for people close to her. Parents, a loved one, or close friends. You can't hesitate with them. And if a person can't do it themselves, then someone else will, like he just did. Kade called out to him with tears in her eyes and said that she apologized for getting angry at him and thank him for finishing off her mother. MC approached the exit and said that he would pick her up at dawn. Until then, she should stay in her room and be quiet. The girl said that the latest news she read online said that zombies become more aggressive at night. Wouldn't it be better for them to leave together at dawn? He explained that he had urgent business. He wanted to deal with it as soon as possible. After some time, the protagonist thought they'd return to the staff room. Kade had marked the school on the map for him, making it one of the evacuation points. He wanted to focus on searching for other survivors. He didn't care whether the zombies became aggressive at night. He even found it more convenient to move around at night, since he didn't have to worry about being seen. Kade worriedly asked if he really needed to go there. The protagonist remembered Iris, and with a smile, wondered if he'd heard that before. He told her not to worry, everything would be fine. He'd already said he'd killed all the zombies on the way here. She nervously grabbed his sleeve and started to say something, but fell silent. The MC wondered if this was all just like the time she'd lost her father, but he didn't feel anything about the situation. He wondered if she needed anything. He'd try to find what he could. Kade replied that she needed him not to leave, but if that wasn't possible, then just let him return safe and sound. The protagonist agreed and replied that he would definitely return safe and sound, that he promised. After that, He went down to the first floor of the department store and thought about how hard it was for him to worry her. But he had to see with his own eyes what was happening in the world and the state of the safe zones. Just in case he killed all the zombies on the second floor, he needed to secure everything. The protagonist went outside and, gathering magic in his crowbar, said they would finish this quickly. After a while, night fell. He mused that he could see the stars in the sky. Even without artificial light, he could move freely using his night vision skill. And the zombies too, like their counterparts from another world. Even if he made as much noise as he could hear, no survivor would see him. MC, destroying every zombie in his path, thought that the crowbar was stronger and sharper than his old bat, so he could more or less use it the same way as the sword from another world. He could even cut off heads if he wanted, but he was still worried about the weak mana conductivity. For now, he'd just keep moving forward, killing zombies. After some time, he arrived at the school building and asked, "Is this where it is?" The protagonist jumped over the fence and noticed that an old man had entered the school grounds during the night. Normally, he would have been reported immediately, but not this time. A huge crowd of zombies appeared before him. He looked around and said he'd start with the gym. Usually, that's where people are gathered in emergency situations. There were also crowds of zombies inside the gym. The protagonist noted that it was obvious that they were indeed gathering survivors here, but everything turned out like this. The main gates were closed, so after the zombie evacuation was complete, the virus somehow got inside the school. He began to scan the entire school for survivors. Climbing onto the roof, the MC noticed that it was clear someone had lived there for some time, but suddenly, a girl appeared from around the corner, moving strangely. He instantly severed her head and asked, "Was it a zombie?" Seeing that her clothes were completely intact, the protagonist removed them and wondered why there were no injuries on her body. Her clothes weren't torn and not even a scratch. Perhaps he hadn't noticed the injury on her head. In another world, turning a person into a zombie required transferring the zombie curse to them. The curse would spread throughout the body until it killed the host. It could also be transferred to an already dead body. In either order, the effect was the same. It's impossible to turn into a zombie until it injures a person. According to Kade, her mother was only bitten on the arm late at night and she became a zombie at dawn. The transformation here takes about 6 hours, so the curse works quite quickly. Are local zombies any different from those in another world? But his always ready for battle skill definitely recognized the auras of these zombies as undead auras. This meant they were all truly dead. However, the skill detected virtually no infection or virus in them. The curse of the zombies from another world was counteracted by the mana in the human body, and with sufficient mana, the bites were harmless. He used his negative effect neutralization skill to combat the undead, and saints like Iris could instantly remove the curse and heal the wounded. Humans in this world become zombies much faster. Could it be that their bodies have virtually no mana to counter the curse? No matter how much he thought, he still couldn't find a definitive answer. He'd better focus on what he could do now. He hadn't found any survivors at the school after all. Under these circumstances, he shouldn't expect much from City Hall. He'd check it out anyway, of course, but the protagonist, moving through the city, suddenly noticed a gaze, hid, and using his enhanced vision skill, wondered if it wasn't a zombie's gaze, but the gaze of a living person. Unlike the always ready for battle scan of the local area, the vision skill allowed him to survey a much larger area, even with his meager mana reserves. Had he been spotted? A man was watching from City Hall. In this darkness, he could easily mistake him for a zombie. Maybe he should hide and find out what was going on there? After a while, the protagonist climbed into a house and, looking around, wondered if City Hall was nearby, and there was a police station next door. Would he be able to see anything from the adjacent building? Perhaps he should also fold his binoculars into subspace. The first floor of City Hall is in complete ruins and filled with zombies, and the roof and upper floors are empty. Have they barricaded the fire exit and stairways inside the building? There are survivors on the roof. They look like sentries. One of them must have used the skill. The doors and windows of the police station are well protected. He knew it. From this distance, he can't scan the entire building for people. But they have sentries on the roof too, which means there are survivors there too. Now he knows there are other survivors, and this place is still safe. Indeed, his younger colleague wrote that he would go to City Hall. Is he still alive? It would be difficult for a normal person to get here, even if they managed to get past the zombies. The remaining question is how to get inside the building. It looks like the destroyed floor of City Hall and the barricaded police station have been in this state since the very first days of the epidemic. So how did they let survivors into such a fortress? But there is still hope for passage. There are a bunch of zombies lying around with gunshot wounds, which he definitely didn't kill. The survivors must have already fled the building several times. Under these circumstances, it's highly likely that the younger one still survived. Since becoming his mentor, he's become very attached to him. He hopes he survived. How should he contact the survivors? He'll think about it later. Now it's time to go back. If this place really is so safe, he'll hand Kade over to them. He thinks that his role as her assistant will be over with. After some time, the protagonist returned to her and knocked on the door. She excitedly opened the door and asked if he was hurt. He was perplexed and said that everything was fine, but that she shouldn't open the door so abruptly. Kade nervously apologized and added that she would be more careful next time. MC asked if she hadn't gone to bed. She replied that she hadn't been able to sleep. She was very worried about him. He wondered if she was afraid he wouldn't return, and with that, her last thread of hope for the future would be severed. Or was she simply worried about him? Knowing this child, the latter was most likely the correct answer. The protagonist smiled and stroked her head, saying that he'd told her everything would be fine, but he still thanked her. He remembered Iris, suddenly calmed down, and, after apologizing, thought that she and this child were very similar, and it wasn't good. It was as if he saw Iris's image in Kade. Well, they exuded a similar atmosphere, and in another world, he often stroked her head. Wasn't he touching her too carelessly? She didn't seem to mind. So what should he do now? He didn't understand anything. After a while, the girl began preparing food, explaining that first, she needed to put it on medium heat. As soon as steam rose, she needed to reduce it to low. She needed to put the marinated mackerel on top to warm it up. The protagonist said that even though he had stocked up on rice and all sorts of utensils, he had never cooked in a pot like this before. She literally saved him. Kade replied with a smile that she'd cooked before, so he could leave it to her. Her mother had taught her how to do it. She thought she was pretty good. He opened the lid and, seeing that the rice was cooked properly, exclaimed that it was a success. The girl delightedly declared that it was ready to eat. The protagonist agreed and added that he'd portion it out. He thought about the warm rice and the pleasant smell. Incidentally, he'd been hungry ever since he'd returned from the other world. He'd fought zombies, found Kade, and explored the area day and night, and still hadn't eaten a single meal. In the other world, he'd gone hungry so often that he'd begun to get used to it. First of all, the local cuisine was terrible. A mysterious weed, bad tasting, like a napkin, but very nutritious. Mysterious bread, hard as a rock. It feels like sand on your teeth. Mysterious dried meat, terribly tough. Oversalted to the point of impossibility. It tastes like rubber, not meat. Mysterious soup, all salt and mint, smells like blood. Completely different ingredients, no seasonings or spices. In short, there were many problems. He gave her the plate and said that she didn't have to wait for him and eat first. She replied that this wasn't right, they would eat together. MC remarked that she was being overly polite. Well, then they would begin their meal. He wished her bon appetit. Kade, tears in her eyes, began to eat rice. He tried it too and thought about how sweet rice simply melted in his mouth. The wonderful taste of warmed marinated mackerel combined with rendered fat. In another world, he never had the chance to try Japanese cuisine. For the first time in 3 years, he felt that taste again, and it made his soul sing. Kade, with tears in her eyes, said it was delicious. The protagonist replied that he understood how she felt, but between eating, crying, and talking, she should choose one. She burned herself and apologized. He handed her a bottle of water and told her not to panic. The girl excitedly apologized and noted that they had to open a new bottle of water. The protagonist replied that she shouldn't worry about it. She could drink and eat as much as she wanted, so she shouldn't worry. Kade thanked him with a smile and said that it really was very tasty. He pointed out that she hadn't gone to bed yet. They would put the rest together and go to bed. She asked if he was going to sleep too, or did he want to go somewhere else? The MC replied that he had enough for today. He wanted to rest. He would sleep in the men's locker room next door. If anything happened, she should call him. After that, he went into the room, lay down on the floor, and thought that he could finally relax a little. Who would have thought such a disaster would befall this world? That video from Kade's story, the link from the younger one's message, most likely with the same video. The zombie panic began a couple of days after the video's release, but why so quickly? According to the latest information Kade had read online, it was clear that this phenomenon had swept across all countries in just a couple of measly days. Yes, they have fast means of transportation like airplanes, but even if there were infected people on board, how could outbreaks of the disease break out simultaneously all over the world? Now he couldn't find an answer. The confusion was driving him crazy. Suddenly, Kade knocked on the door and asked if he was awake. The protagonist silently opened the door, and she fearfully told him to at least answer before opening it. Now about carelessness, he said. Don't open the door so abruptly, he replied with a calm face that he was allowed to. So what did she want? The girl asked sheepishly if they could sleep in the same room. MC thought, perplexed, that if this were a completely different world, he would try to convince her not to. But now she was terrified of loneliness, so there was nothing to be done. He agreed, and after a while, they lay down in the same room. Kade asked if she could ask a question. The protagonist replied that she should ask whatever she wanted. She suddenly fell silent and became nervous. He asked, so what? She wanted to ask. The girl wondered if he would be leaving when they woke up. The protagonist replied that he wouldn't, that he had no special plans for now. Kade asked again, was that true? Would he be here when she woke up? He promised her and thought that he understood why she was being so cautious. This answer was all he could do to help her. Would she be able to get any sleep now? Sometime later, when it was already light, the protagonist woke up. The girl in her sleep started calling his name. He adjusted her blanket and she immediately woke up, then wished her good morning. MC asked if he'd woken her and if she could forgive him. Kade, smiling, was about to answer, but suddenly began coughing violently. He touched her forehead and remarked that she seemed to have a fever. He told her to wait a little. She grabbed his leg and said, please stay. The protagonist replied that she shouldn't be afraid. He wasn't going down from this floor. After a while, a sound was heard from the next room, and then he came to her. Kade asked in surprise, What was he doing in the next room? The protagonist silently picked her up and began carrying her into the room. She exclaimed in shock. She can walk on her own. He calmly replied that it was dangerous for her to move around right now. The MC carried her to a room with a full-size bed and told her that he had found some bedding nearby. She could get a good rest there. He laid her down on the bed and asked, "How's it going?" He probably should have brought a futon or a mattress. Kade replied that she didn't think there was one. The protagonist said it didn't matter. He wondered if he'd said too much. She'd lost her parents, was surrounded by hordes of zombies, and was terrified of being alone. A comfortable night's sleep was the last thing on her mind. An old man like him, especially with powers from another world, could easily move even a bed. But even the thought of leaving the floor terrifies her. Should he have told her he was lucky he found the bed linen? What a fool he was. He apologized and told her to rest and get well soon. Kade agreed and asked if he could sit with her until she fell asleep. The protagonist sat down on a chair and agreed. She told him that before going to bed she had wanted to ask him one more thing, but she hadn't gotten around to it. He inquired, and what was it? The girl anxiously asked if his parents were okay. MC explained that they had died in a car accident long ago. He had no other relatives, but if they had lived, they could have died in a world like this, so it was even better. Kade replied that she understood now. He should forgive her. It had been a rude question. He told her not to worry. She could ask him anything. She smiled and remarked that he was very kind. The protagonist was perplexed, wondering if he was kind. In another world, members of the same race could doubt each other. Sometimes they abandoned comrades to certain death. They even didn't hesitate to kill relatives, and there were many such people in that world. And he returned to this world, abandoning his faithful comrades. The concept of kindness doesn't apply to him. He replied that she was mistaken. That's it. It's time for her to sleep. Kade agreed and repeated that he was very kind. He's not going anywhere, is he? The protagonist replied that he wasn't kind. Sometime later, she woke up while he was cooking. The girl smiled and remarked that she really did feel much better. What was he doing? The MC replied that he had reheated the leftover rice she cooked yesterday. He added green tea. It was good for digestion, so she should try to eat. If she wanted anything else, she should just say so, and he'd get it. Kade thanked him with a smile and asked what he meant by that. He replied that he couldn't find any cold medicine nearby. He'd have to go outside, so if she wanted anything, she better. Suddenly, the girl exclaimed in horror that she couldn't. She didn't want him to put himself in danger. She was feeling much better already, right? She was sure nothing serious would happen to her. It was just a little overexertion. He had to go outside yesterday because he needed to do something, but she didn't want him to put himself in danger. She didn't like him going outside at all, but still, the protagonist thought he understood everything. If someone got hurt again because of her, Kade would simply break down. Her father never returned to her, so she was trying with all her might to prevent a repeat of that. From her point of view, it looked like she was forcing him to risk himself for supplies, and then she even got a cut of it. But in their situation, it's a necessary risk if they want to survive. From his perspective, Kade's behavior is unreasonable. She called out to him and asked if she had angered him somehow. The protagonist replied that it wasn't so. He wondered if he was overthinking things. She was just worried about him. He didn't need to feed such thoughts any further. He had already decided that he would help her, and that was all that mattered. The MC apologized and said he was thinking for a moment. They had talked about going outside for sure. The problem would go away if he went out to do his business. Kade became upset and fell silent. Seeing this, he wondered if he had convinced her. The protagonist asked if they should have breakfast. Should he help her out of bed? The girl replied with a smile that it was fine. She could do it herself. He was very kind after all. They sat down at the table and began to eat. She remarked that the green tea was quite tasty. After some time, the protagonist emerged outside and began scattering zombies. He then wondered if he should also take out the cars. MC wondered what had happened a couple of days after Kade's illness began. Could he stay a little longer? She kept asking. He couldn't leave for a long time because she begged him to stay with her. Only when she began to move more easily did he manage to broach the subject. And when he said he might be gone for a couple of days, her eyes began to water. She was only able to leave under the pretext of his business. He'd left her plenty of water and food, and the barricades were reinforced, so she wouldn't have any problems. Although, if he were gone too long, he was afraid her heart wouldn't take it. Getting Kade to the shelter safe and sound, that was his main goal. He considered using the car, but to do that, he needed to get rid of the zombies and other cars blocking their passage. The plan was to clear a path by moving the cars closer to the edge, but that proved problematic. Frankly, he wanted to just toss the cars as far as possible, but that could trigger an explosion, which was too dangerous. Now was not the time to attract attention with unnecessary noise, so he had only one option: carefully move them to the side of the road, one by one. Suddenly, the zombies began to attack him again. The protagonist, concentrating his mana in his weapon, asked if he would ever get rid of them so they wouldn't come back. Come on, let them come quickly. After some time, he destroyed them all, and wondered if his efforts to make it look as natural as possible had been in vain. Well, a new batch of zombies would arrive here soon, which would add a touch of naturalness to the place. So, the next target was the car. He would choose the most durable one and fill it with gas from the other cars. After some time, MC did everything and, sitting behind the wheel, thought that now he would try everything out in practice. After knocking down a couple of zombies, he thought that it would be a little crowded here when he drove Kade, but they would definitely be able to drive through a horde of zombies. He'd cleared the road, found a car, and now he needed to park it closer to the department store. He'd retrieve food and supplies from subspace later. Now he needed to go to the bike shop and gather everything he needed for first contact with the shelter. He spent the rest of the night in one of the apartments next to the city hall. It would be better to make contact with them during the day. After some time, he climbed into the empty apartment and, taking out onigiri, thought that Kade had cooked it. While he ate, he could think, would the survivors let them into their shelter? He didn't care about him, but the main thing was that they accepted her. He'll assume they'll accept her, but there's no guarantee Kade will be safe there. She might survive, but that didn't mean they wouldn't mistreat her. In such a world, not everyone would agree to live by the old ways. Before him, a broken man might have infiltrated this department store. No matter how much food they could offer, if it wasn't safe for Kade, he wouldn't leave her there. He'd find out everything at the meeting tomorrow. The next day, the protagonist donned his motorcycle gear and considered swapping his bloody shirt for a biker jacket from the store. Blood wouldn't show on black, plus it was harder to stain. The main thing was to present himself well, and a bloody shirt wouldn't help. Now, it was time to go. He pulled a motorcycle out of subspace and wondered how he could make another ring like that. Lobelia was a genius, after all. It looked like such a small hole, but it held such dimensions. MC mounted the motorcycle and, putting on his helmet, reflected on several reasons why he'd chosen a bike for his first meeting with the survivors. One reason is to be able to wear a helmet without raising suspicion. These people could still pose a threat. It's best not to show them his face ahead of time. A helmet can be worn simply for extra protection at times like these. But a helmeted person is more at home on a bike than on two legs. If something goes wrong, there's a good chance they'll start shooting at him. The police station should have plenty of weapons. Some could have been moved to City Hall. He hopes it won't come to that. At least that way he'll be able to show them he's not a zombie, but a human being who knows how to ride a bike. And if something does go wrong, he can quickly leave without revealing his identity. After that, he set off, cutting off zombie heads along the way. After a while, the protagonist began to think he felt a gaze coming from somewhere above. It must be the guards from City Hall. They had organized a night patrol, but they remained vigilant during the day as well, which was to be expected. He needed to be more careful with this. Suddenly, a man on guard began pointing and shouting. The protagonist wondered in confusion. Was he pointing in the direction of the police station? The man had shouted, "Wasn't he a refugee? There's a ladder over there by the police station. Let him climb it." He wondered in surprise. Was there a rope ladder attached to the window of the police station? Just as he thought. Zombies react more strongly to human voices. A living person is like a piece of meat to a hungry dog. Their brains don't function. All they can do is go directly to the primary stimulus. They don't understand that a person is out of reach. In other words, the man from City Hall is attracting zombies with his screams, while people on the street are making their way to the stairs near the police station. And the zombies, of course, can't climb the stairs. It's a pretty logical move. The MC stopped abruptly and, as he started to climb, thought about whether he was still being watched. It was better for him not to stand out too much. Suddenly, Tsugumi Oda, the head of the police station, climbed out of the window and, holding out his hand, shouted, "Just a little more. Let him grab onto it." The protagonist offered his hand and he pulled him up. After that, the man excitedly cried out, "Is he okay? Is he hurt anywhere? He did a great job." The protagonist, perplexed, replied that he was fine. He thanks him for his help. He took off his helmet and said that he heard that survivors were hiding here. Oda, smiling, remarked that it meant he got the information from the internet. Yes, they're safe here. Let him believe him. He's the head of this station. What's his name? By this time, the remaining police officers had arrived. MC gave his name and thought he could sense a hint of hostility in the officers' gazes. They were probably just being cautious. He couldn't scan the entire building, but he could already sense at least 30 survivors. He didn't know how many police officers were here, but many had managed to reach this evacuation point. Oda said, "Forgive him for starting their acquaintance like this. But could he please take off his clothes?" The protagonist thought their wariness had increased. Hearing this, he chuckled silently. The police officer said he was serious. The protagonist smiled and replied, "Forgive him for laughing. This was obviously a necessary check. They could search him as much as they wanted." After that, he took off his clothes. Oda, examining him, took his hand and said he would try to do everything quickly. And he, by the way, was in good shape. What did he do before? The MC replied that he worked out at the gym on the weekends, but he'd appreciate it if he'd stop groping him like that. The other officers chuckled at this. He wondered if the atmosphere had become tense. Perhaps he'd been dwelling on it too much? In the end, it all turned out to be a misunderstanding. Now he didn't have to worry about them stabbing him in the back. Oda said everything was fine, no wounds or anything out of the ordinary. He wouldn't cause them any trouble. Let him greet him again. If he didn't mind, let him hand over his weapons and luggage for now, and then he'd show him their hideout. The protagonist agreed, and handing over the crowbar, mused that, based on what had happened, he could say they were somewhat trustworthy. But even if things suddenly changed, and they took up arms, it wouldn't be a problem for him. He called the head of the police station chief, and asked how many refugees were gathered there. Oda replied with a smile that he didn't have to force himself to use formalities like Mr. Boss. He could bet they were the same age, right? MC thanked him and remarked that he'd made his life easier. He hadn't addressed anyone politely in a long time, so it was a bit difficult for him. He said that, by the way, he was 35. How old was he? The protagonist replied that he was also 35. Let him speak to him in whatever way was most comfortable. He thought that he was 35. Not counting the years he'd spent in another world. Oda happily noted that they were the same age, after all. Well, they'd get back to his question. There were about 20 refugees in this building alone, and another 10 in the mayor's office. The protagonist replied that he understood everything. By the way, they had a good idea about distracting the zombies. They positioned the survivor so they couldn't reach him, kept drawing them to City Hall, and at the last minute, he showed up and helped him. That's good teamwork. The policeman replied with a smile that he was just doing what he could. Well, it was time for them to move on. This was the 3rd floor, where the refugees lived. The police had taken the 2nd, 4th, and rooftop floors. They still had some rooms available, so he could choose whichever one he wanted. MC, looking around, realized there were about 10 survivors on this floor. One of them suddenly started running fast. Suddenly, Yukinoshita, the protagonist's former colleague, hugged him tearfully and asked, "So he'd been alive all this time?" He asked in shock. "So that means she survived, right?" Oda, seeing all this, asked in confusion, "Is that her boyfriend?" The protagonist replied no, he was her mentor at work. But he couldn't even imagine that she was still alive. Yukinoshita exclaimed that she should be the one saying that. He hadn't shown up for work or even responded to her messages. He nervously apologized and explained that a lot had happened. The girl replied with displeasure that even so, it was still possible. MC thought about how he hadn't really believed she could reach safety safely. He was certainly happy about this, but he still had work to do. If he asked the local survivors about what had happened from the first zombie outbreak to the present, he might find a lot of useful information. Yukinoshita knew him well, and that could ruin everything. So how could he justify his absence from this world while he was wandering around in another world? Oda smiled and noted that he saw that they were well acquainted. Then, he could safely entrust Azami to this girl, right? Yukinoshita grabbed his hand and, agreeing, added that she would explain everything to the master, and he'll also find out what all those different things were. The protagonist replied that she shouldn't drag him out so much. She tearfully said that if she didn't do this, he might disappear again. Sometime later, the two of them came into the room, and Yukinoshita sat down on a chair with a dissatisfied expression. MC said that she should forgive him. It was his fault for not contacting her, but he really had been very busy. He, kneeling, thought about her demanding that he kneel before her, even brought tears to his eyes, so he simply resigned himself to it. Where was this all heading? Yukinoshita replied discontentedly that she accepted such an answer. She wanted to believe that something really serious had happened to him. And yet, why was he so calm? Yes, they were safe, and even managed to meet, but still, he had become somehow abrupt. It's as if he doesn't care. The protagonist replied that that wasn't true. He too was glad that she was alive. He was truly worried about her. He'd only come to this place because he'd read her letter. He wondered if he was being honest. He genuinely wanted her to survive. But some part of him had resigned himself to the fact that it might not happen. He'd spent 3 years in a world where people were dying in droves, so resignation had become second nature. And yet, had he become harsh? Yukinoshita, wiping away tears, replied with a smile that everything was fine then. Incidentally, since he'd read her message where she'd written that she was heading to the mayor's office, why hadn't he written back? The protagonist wondered if he'd screwed up. After a while, he went out into the hallway and thought about how Yukinoshita had completely drained him of his soul after that. He'd had to make up a story about fleeing to a place with poor reception during the pandemic, so he hadn't written. To avoid saying anything unnecessary, he'd asked her not to ask for details. He'd managed to avoid the conversation about another world. He slightly embellished the story of how he met Kade while foraging for food. And of course he was scolded by her for abandoning the poor girl alone. He should have checked if it was safe here before bringing her, he said. And when the conversation turned to him going to Oda to discuss a rescue plan, she reluctantly let him go. MC, looking around, thought that the refugees looked content. Of course, things weren't the same anymore, but apparently, they were happy with the local living conditions. According to Yukinoshita, they periodically replenish supplies and to this day distribute them equally among everyone. But one thing still bothered him. Were women treated fairly here? But she convinced him that there was nothing to worry about. Work was distributed among the survivors based on their gender and personal abilities. Women remain in the building and are safe, cleaning, laundry, cooking, and so on. But male refugees sometimes perform dangerous work. The police are constantly at risk. For example, they participate only in foraging expeditions for food. There is also the construction of barricades and acting as bait. Since Yukinoshita arrived here, no major conflicts have arisen. He himself couldn't detect anything strange, so if he brought Kade here, there wouldn't be any problems, right? The protagonist approached the policewoman and said he wanted to speak with the head of the precinct. After a while, he entered the office. Oda, seeing him, asked if something was wrong. The MC replied that he wanted to consult. No, First, he wanted to apologize. He came here to make sure this shelter was safe. Well, I mean, how should he put it? He thought he was trying to say it somehow more gently, but he couldn't find the words. Okay, he'll tell it like it is. The protagonist said he left a girl somewhere, the one he'd taken on to protect. Basically, he was only here to see if she could live here. Could he bring her here? He'd have to excuse him, but Yukinoshita said there was a close-knit community here, so he wanted to bring this child here. He'd be entirely responsible for transporting her, and if the proliferation of hungry mouths bothered him, he wouldn't be staying here for long anyway. Oda calmly noted Yukinoshita's implication. If one of the first survivors under their wing spoke so of this place, then all their efforts had been worth it. If he claimed to bring her himself, he had no reason to refuse. If they both returned safe and sound, then they would be responsible for their future safety. Whether or not to leave this place was, of course, his business, but the man grew nervous and, showing the map, said, "Fine, no matter. In any case, since this is how things turned out, he'll tell you something. Tomorrow they're organizing a foray for new supplies. They could leave the shelter together as a group. What will he say about this?" The protagonist replied that they would do so. Thank you. He owes him. After that, he left the office and reflected on how he'd accepted his offer and, after this conversation, had taken part in developing the strategy for the upcoming foray. And yet, he wondered what Oda wanted to say. His sad gaze seemed to burn a hole in his head. After some time, night fell. The MC, sitting in the room, thought about how he'd stared at the ceiling in the dark. He wanted to wait until morning in the central room, the one closest to the stairs. According to Yukinoshita, he had nothing to worry about. But just in case, he continued to keep an eye on anyone passing by his room. At sunrise, he and the police squad would head out to replenish their supplies. He owed them a favor, so he decided to help them find supplies. He also wanted to see how they worked, which wouldn't hurt. After helping them, he'd pick a good time and separate. It would be best for him to avoid engaging in a fight with a group of zombies while they were still within their line of sight. He'd then drive back safely. It might arouse their suspicions, but he had no better plans. Suddenly, the protagonist sensed someone near the door and asked if it was Yukinoshita. The girl walked inside and asked how he knew it was her. He replied that he was new here, so only she could have checked on him. She turned off the flashlight and remarked that it was best not to waste the battery, so she would turn it off if he didn't mind. He'd leave her again tomorrow, right? MC agreed. Yukinoshita jealously remarked that it would have been better if he had simply asked Oda to bring Kade instead. He replied that she shouldn't talk nonsense. It was his personal business. He couldn't bother him with such things. The girl asked if he'd been lucky today, but what if next time it didn't happen? Confused, the protagonist asked, "What do you mean?" She nervously replied that they'd assume he'd managed to reach Kade, and even that they'd find a safe route to City Hall. But luck could run out at any moment. The fact that they'd managed to reach safety was already a stroke of luck. She'd seen it countless times before. Survivors had died right before her eyes, simply trying to get here. But the next moment, they were dead. She'd seen it again and again. The thought that the same fate could befall her filled her with fear. As she climbed the stairs, one of the infected grabbed her leg. He tore her sneaker off, and she still can't forget that day. Isn't he scared? He thought he was sure that not only she, but all the other survivors lived in the same fear of zombies, and he was the only one who didn't feel the same way. But he couldn't even tell her why. It made him feel guilty, an unbearable feeling. He replied that she was right. He wasn't scared. The protagonist thought that therefore he would speak frankly. He would open up to her, and perhaps that would ease his guilt a little. Yukinoshita worriedly remarked that he seemed a bit too cold-blooded. After this conversation, the girl left the room. He thought that her words had been swirling in his head until dawn. The next day at 9 a.m., everyone went outside. Oda explained that they were leaving in 2 earthquake response vehicles, which they had slightly modified for food runs. The vehicles were currently parked in the station garage. The cars are durable, easy to knock down zombies with, and they have high ground clearance, making them easy to repair if necessary. The protagonist, putting on the gear, wondered if the cars were so safe, then he didn't need it, right? It was hard to move around in that gear. The man replied, "No need for that. You can never have too much protection, and it would make foraging for supplies easier. So let him try to be patient." The protagonist sat down and thought about the Special Forces protective gear made of Kevlar fiber. Truthfully, he didn't need it, but if he hadn't put it on, the Oda squad would have been overly protective. Well, maybe he could still use it. He'll give it to Kade. The head of the police station, armed, exclaimed that they were moving out. Here's their plan. There's a radio at the police station. They'll use it to contact the mayor's office. They'll lure the zombies away from the garage, the same way they did when they rescued a zombie. A lookout stands over the garage and will let them know when the passage is clear. After that, the police officers and refugees will carefully open the garage doors. While they're at it, they start their cars and drive out, while the remaining police officers climb into the back of the car. After a while, they've pulled off the entire plan. The protagonist, sitting in the car, remarked that everything was going smoothly as expected. Oda replied that leaving was always easy. The problems would start on the way back. The garage door would be closed until the passage was cleared of zombies again. If they charged ahead, they'd simply bring the infected with them. He agreed. noting that the sound of the car would only attract more zombies. And what would happen if they couldn't get rid of the zombies? The precinct chief replied that that would be the worst possible outcome. MC, looking at him, considered the gloomy expression that hadn't left his face. They followed a predetermined route, shooting down any zombies they encountered. Their first stop was a convenience store on the main highway. They arrived shortly afterward, and Oda shouted that they had 2 minutes to act quickly. All the police officers got out of the car and headed toward the store. The protagonist thought about how, at his command, the squad of police officers immediately got out of the car. They were wearing protective gear and armed with axes and guns. Pistols were too loud and were used as a last resort. They worked in teams of 2. One held the zombie down, and the other finished it off with an axe. The opponents were zombies, so fighting one-on-one was unsafe. The police officers had undergone special training, so they had every chance of winning. This was a good strategy against zombies, but suddenly, the radio turned on, and a police officer reported that they had found one in the staff room. It had been eliminated. None of them were injured. The protagonist remarked that this was excellent. He reflected that before the cleanup began, he'd offered to help them, but Oda had stopped him and told him to watch first, so he agreed to observe. Upon arriving, he'd used his skill to detect one zombie in the building, but he couldn't tell them about it. He could only tell them to be careful and watch their plan unfold. He was glad they'd succeeded. The police quickly cleared the area and began carrying out the groceries. It took 2 trips to clear everything from the store. Everything was done so quickly that they didn't even have to fight the new batch of zombies. Not a single extra zombie was killed. They really did it all in 2 minutes. Oda's leadership and the other group members' skills were simply superb. After that, everyone got into the car and moved on. After a while, MC reflected on how they had visited several more small stores. And finally, they reached the final and most important point on the list, the supermarket. Oda noticed that all the supermarket gates were closed. He thought they had managed to seal all the entrances and exits before the panic reached this place. Since then, this place had remained untouched. There must be plenty of supplies here. Let Azami not stray too far. Instead of rushing into battle, it would be better for him to keep an eye on the area and try to protect himself, okay? The protagonist agreed, and they infiltrated the supermarket. He reflected on how they quickly opened the gates and drove in. Before they could close the gates, several zombies followed them. Fortunately, they couldn't reach the back of the car. With each swing of the axe, at least one zombie was eliminated. He thought he'd have to intervene if the situation escalated, but apparently that wasn't necessary. Everyone got out of the car. There were no signs of zombies in the building. As they infiltrated another department, the protagonist inquired about opening the gates again when they left. And wouldn't that attract nearby groups? Oda agreed, holding a flashlight, saying that by the time they finished, the zombies would have scattered again and wouldn't have time to attack en masse. But caution certainly couldn't hurt. Okay, everyone, let them search for supplies and keep an eye out. They needed to move in groups and be careful. After a while, they began to search the entire supermarket and gather provisions. The protagonist reflected that they had to explore the supermarket only with flashlights, so it took them about half a day. But other than that, there were no problems. The search and gathering of the necessary supplies went smoothly. Loading up the box, he thought about the fact that it contained 9 2-liter bottles of water. He needs to pretend it's hard. The MC folded the box and, looking tired, said it was all ready. Oda happily remarked that he'd done a good job. It was the last box for the day. They're heading back. They need to clear the exit. Let them move the corpses to the wall. Then they open the gate and quickly drive out. They did all this and hit the road. The site manager noted that everything was as usual. The infected were chasing the lead car. While they were distracting them, the people in the second car would close the gate and catch up. The protagonist said that he had thought of every detail as expected. Oda replied that that wasn't true. Was he really going there? He thought, he's just doing what he can, right? The protagonist agreed with a calm expression. The man remarked that the infected didn't seem to scare him at all. If there were at least one like him in the shelter, things would be easier for them. He replied that when he returned to them, he would help in any way he could. The MC considered this as the end of the conversation. They spent the rest of the drive in silence. The only sound was Oda's radio. He seemed to want to say something, but couldn't bring himself to do so. They reached a place where there were no zombies in sight, and they dropped him off. Afterwards, he remarked that they would part ways there. He didn't know when that would be, but he would try to pick a day with good weather and drive straight to them. The protagonist set off, thinking that all he heard behind him was Oda's sad voice, after which he quickly left. The man himself sadly told him to take care of himself. After some time, the protagonist reflected on how he returned to the supermarket on a rainy night. Before contacting the survivors in the shelter, he had previously parked the car in one of the supermarket's parking spaces. Now the car needed to be moved closer to the main entrance. Kade was still alone. Was she safe? The reason he hadn't done this sooner was because some stranger might have noticed the car in an unusual location. Best not to give them any reason to think there was anyone in the building. He had been gone for 2 whole days. Had Kade gotten better? Or had her cold gotten worse? No. He'd known all along that he'd be gone for a few days. Why was he worrying unnecessarily? The protagonist began dispatching all the zombies and wondered if there were zombies on the first floor again. But apparently, thanks to the barricade, They didn't reach the second floor. The barricades he'd set up on the second and third floors also appeared intact, and not a single alien aura or zombie was present. He sensed Kade's aura and thought with a smile that, judging by everything, she was safe and sound. After a while, MC knocked on the door and asked if she was there. The girl asked if it was Azami. He agreed and wondered if that meant she'd followed his advice and wasn't so eager to open doors. She slowly opened the door, saw him, and greeted him with a hug. Kade worriedly asked if he was hurt. Was he okay? The protagonist replied that he was fine, but completely wet, so she shouldn't cling to him like that. He wasn't used to this. The girl sheepishly stepped away and said it was okay. She didn't care. The protagonist asked if she'd recovered. She agreed with a smile and added that she was feeling much better now, and it was all thanks to him. He replied that was good. Then he'd go into the other room to dry off a bit. Kade nervously apologized and pointed out that she was always talking about herself. It would be bad if he caught a cold. The MC replied that she shouldn't worry about it. He stepped out into the hallway and thought that he wouldn't catch a cold, even if he spent the whole day soaking wet. There was one skill he could use even in front of witnesses: negative effect neutralization. He hadn't gotten sick even once since he'd acquired this skill in another world. But walking around soaking wet was just plain uncomfortable. So he decided to get a towel and a new set of clothes from Subspace. Now he could take off his police protection and that intimidating biker outfit. First he'd dry off and then change. And by the way, there was one more thing. The protagonist stuck his hand into Subspace and after a while entered the common room. Kade noted that he had spare clothes. He agreed, saying that she'd gotten wet recently too. She could change into these. Seeing the new clothes, she asked in surprise, "Where did he get these? Doesn't it look too weird?" She hoped they suit her. MC agreed and explained that he'd found the set by chance while he was out minding his own business. Were they pinching her anywhere? The girl happily replied that they weren't. He thought that in a world like this, whether clothes suited a person or not hardly mattered. The main thing was that they weren't too tight. But maybe that still mattered to a girl like her. He was simply trying to choose clothes that would be easiest for her to move in. He didn't think new clothes were a reason to be happy. But if she was happy, then all was well. Kade sat down on a chair and said that he must be freezing, so she boiled some water for him. The protagonist thanked her and said he'd be happy to drink it. She pointed out that the water was very hot, so he should be careful. Honestly, it would have been better to make him coffee, but he took the mug of boiling water and asked if he needed to get her some coffee. She replied that wasn't what she had in mind. The protagonist considered the effects of neutralized negative effects and felt neither cold nor heat, but now he felt his body warm up. Suddenly, Kade said, upset, that at one point she'd thought he wouldn't come back after all. He replied that he'd said he'd come back, even if it was only for a few days. She worriedly asked him not to think she was blaming him, okay? It was just that a night had passed and he still hadn't returned. She'd started to worry, and yet, here he was, back to her. It was wonderful. She was so happy. MC called out to her and remarked that she'd once said she'd do anything. Was that offer still open? Kade became incredibly nervous and said she'd agree to anything, but couldn't he prepare her a little? Confused, he asked, prepare her for what? Well, in short, they were leaving soon. They were going to the survivors. He found a shelter that was still functioning and safe. There were plenty of people there, and he thought it was peaceful. It would be much safer for her, she asked excitedly. So they'll move there together? The protagonist agreed and added that their leader, Oda, had asked for his help so he would stay there too. He reflected that he didn't know how long he'd stay, but until he left, he'd keep an eye on her. He'd do what he could. Kade replied that was fine then. She understood. The protagonist said they'd leave in 2 or 3 days. They'd try to get her ready a bit in that time, but for now, it was time to go to bed. She agreed and asked what they would do tomorrow. He replied that he had some work to do. He wouldn't be leaving the building. Consider it part of the preparations. She smiled as she lay down and wished him good night. The next morning, MC, getting dressed, thought it was time to start preparing. On the day of their departure, they would descend not the escalators where the main barricade stood, but the stairs behind the emergency exit. First, they needed to clear the way so Kade could easily reach the main entrance, where the car was parked. He needed to remove all obstacles, scattered goods, and overturned shelves. He also needed to get rid of the new zombies and clean up the corpses of the old ones. Seeing the pile of corpses would make her worry that they would rise again. Her anxiety slowed her down. More zombies would appear on the day of departure, but getting rid of them shortly beforehand wouldn't be a problem. The protagonist easily destroyed all the zombies and remarked that the place was clean, so to speak. For now, the path from the stairs to the car was clear. Next, he'd leave the emergency exit open. He spotted a zombie and said he'd be right there. The protagonist led him along and thought that they would lead the zombies out through the emergency exit and then to the fire escape. Then they'd carefully circle around it and close the emergency exit. After that, he delivered a powerful kick and, pushing the zombie away, thought that the preparations were almost complete. All that remained was to call Kade. After a while, MC returned to the room. At that moment, she was packing her things. Seeing him, she happily remarked that it was a relief he was okay. He replied with a serious expression that she was always too worried about him. He didn't want to distract her from packing her luggage, but it was time to talk about his request. Kade became very nervous and said that she'd at least like to be mentally prepared. The protagonist replied that it wouldn't hurt. It was time to keep his promises. He took her hand and led her into the hallway. She was very nervous. The protagonist led her to a room and told her to hold her hands out in front of her, palms up. A revolver instantly appeared in her hands. Kade, shocked, asked, "Isn't that a gun?" He replied with a serious expression, "Hold on tight and don't drop it." MC thought about the black and heavy object. Most people had seen it, but few Japanese had actually held it in their hands. He pointed out that she would kill the zombie with it. The girl, seeing the zombie, asked, "Should she really do it?" The protagonist replied with a serious expression that the solution to the impending threat was a bullet. He told her to aim the gun at the zombie and then pull the trigger. He stood up, telling her to calm down and aim for the head. She anxiously aimed the gun and froze. He asked, "Is something wrong?" The girl, horrified, replied that she couldn't. Maybe he could do it? The protagonist quickly delivered a powerful kick and said that if she was so eager to surrender, she should have done it sooner. It was dangerous. Could she move? Okay, he'd asked differently. Would she be able to return to the room on her own? Kade fearfully agreed. He indicated that she should go then, and he would clean up the mess. He took the gun. After she left, MC wondered if she had hesitated to kill the zombie out of disgust, or had the approaching zombie frightened her so much that she couldn't move. If something like this happened at the shelter stairs, they simply wouldn't be able to climb up. Had it been right to test her? He opened the empty magazine and wondered if she would forgive him. It was just an imitation. Eventually, he would give her real bullets. Kade had to learn to defend herself. At that moment, the zombie once again climbed the stairs. The protagonist plunged the crowbar into its head and then returned to the hallway. Seeing the girl sitting on the floor, he said they were going back to the room. She apologized, upset, and remarked that she couldn't do anything. The protagonist replied that she shouldn't apologize. He couldn't think of a better method. If she also petrified herself at the sight of a living zombie on the day of their escape, they'd be in big trouble. He'd simply wanted to rid her of her fear of zombies, but it hadn't worked. Kade remarked that she'd completely failed then. He agreed and added that it was good they hadn't left it for the last day, but they'd have to do it again later. They'd practice until she got used to zombies. Kade excitedly agreed, and they went to the room. The protagonist wondered if he'd thought she'd start cursing him and saying something like, "Why is he so cruel?" And so from that day on, it rained non-stop outside, and Kade continued to come face to face with zombies. During this time, he managed to explain in detail the evacuation plan to the police station. He needed to test her physical fitness, just in case, but she seemed confident in her abilities. She said it wouldn't be a problem for her to quickly run out of the car and climb the stairs. After learning the details of the evacuation, she understood why you should never slow down when you see a zombie. This gave her the motivation to repeat their lesson. Kade still couldn't pull the trigger. Perhaps something inside her prevents her from killing a creature that was originally human. Such behavior is perfectly natural for ordinary people, and for a good girl, all this is unbearable. But if she wants to survive in this world, such feelings are nothing more than a hindrance. Sometime later, after another disastrous training session, the protagonist said that he hoped she would one day be able to kill a zombie. Kade, her hands shaking, agreed. He wondered why she still trembled when she picked up the gun, but remembering the very first day he gave it to her, she became much more confident. The next day, MC thought the rain had finally stopped. It was the perfect day for a trip. He asked if she was ready. Kade confidently agreed and tied her hair in a ponytail. The protagonist considered the ponytail, the backpack on her back, and even the enthusiasm in her voice. At first, he wanted her to wear the protective gear Oda had given him, but they had decided against it. He could still protect her. And on the big day, their greatest advantage would be speed. Kade wore only the Kevlar fiber part of the talisman, and to protect herself as best she could, she threw a jacket over her hoodie. The clothes he gave her were in the backpack. They would be a spare set. Kade called out to him, noting that it was a bit awkward, but there's something she wants to do. He replied that he didn't mind, but what did she want? The girl stood silently in front of the locker room door and began to pray. MC, seeing this, wondered if she was praying to her dead mother. He asked if he should stand outside the door. She replied that no, everything was fine. The protagonist wondered if she understood that they wouldn't be coming back here again. He wondered what she was thinking about with such a mysterious expression on her face. After a while, Kade finished and apologized for the wait. She noted that she couldn't say goodbye to her father, but his backpack would always be with her. The protagonist opened the door and asked if they were heading straight to the exit. The girl confidently agreed, and they set off. After a while, they got into the car and started driving. MC began running over every zombie they came across. Kade screamed in fear, telling him to go ahead. He replied that they weren't human anymore anyway, so she shouldn't worry so much. They couldn't even be called animals. Although if they see a dog or a cat somewhere, he'll slow down. He's starting to worry about their success. The girl nervously exclaimed that everything was fine. She was just surprised. The protagonist replied that he hoped so. He wondered if she was a little used to zombies. At least that's what she said. But he didn't know how she'd react to a whole horde of zombies. The worst thing would be if she simply froze in place. Then he'd have to drag her up the stairs himself. But under the current circumstances, he couldn't do that. He'd have to get back in the car and start all over again. There was nothing to be done. He'd have to act at random. They'd hope Kade would hold out. He felt a heightened gaze, watching from the roof of the shelter. It seemed they'd figured out who was in the car. They'd even set the bait. The protagonist called out to her and asked if she was sure she was ready. She agreed and began listing how she needed to stay calm, move quickly, not trip over anything, and not look back. He replied that that was true, and that she shouldn't worry about him. He would have her back, so she wouldn't have to look back. When she climbed the ladder, she shouldn't look down. She should trust him and climb quickly. And now it was time to begin. They stopped, and the girl began running quickly toward the ladder. MC, covering her from behind, wondered if she was doing as he said. She acted calmly and didn't look back, running straight for the ladder. Suddenly, one of the zombies pointed his hand toward her backpack, trying to grab it. He, remembering Kade taking her father's backpack as a memento, instantly killed the enemy and told him to just try. The protagonist thought about how he shouldn't kill zombies too pretentiously, but rather lightly hit them with a crowbar. Puncture them, barely pull the crowbar out, and hit them sparingly. Oda and the police, and most likely even Yukinoshita, were watching him now. Playing a daredevil was quite amusing. So, had Kade managed to climb up safely? The protagonist looked up and saw that she had already climbed through the window using the ladder. Oda called out to him excitedly and told him to come here too. Quickly. The girl, afraid for him, looked out the window and almost fell. A policeman grabbed her and told her to be careful. It was dangerous out there. The MC wondered how he could climb up faster. He instantly pierced the zombie's head with a crowbar and, bracing his foot against it, made a sharp lunge and grabbed the ladder, then climbed through the window. Oda, in shock, asked, "Who is he anyway?" The protagonist replied with a smile that he had returned. Kade stood there, tears in her eyes. Yukinoshita told the girl. She thought he warned her. These are the rules. First they need to inspect her body. Kade blushed, feeling awkward. Azami said in a disgruntled voice, "There's a policewoman standing outside the door, so there's no need to worry about anyone breaking in." The girl, embarrassed, told him she understood. Yukinoshita turned to her mentor indignantly, noting that even if the girl was safe, she still felt awkward. He was completely insensitive. The protagonist said, "That's it." His colleague continued, "Not everyone is capable of undressing at the first request and telling them to look around as much as they want. He has no tact." The MC apologized and said he understood. Yukinoshita told the girl that if she wanted to rest, she could do so in the mentor's room. The girl introduced herself and explained that she and the protagonist worked at the same company. Kade replied that everything was clear to her. She told the girl her name and said that MC had saved her. Before the pandemic, she was a first-year high school student. Yukinoshita said she was glad to meet her. She asked the girl if she could call her by her first name. Kade happily replied that she could. She added that she was also very glad to meet her. Yukinoshita suggested she call her Yuki or Sumire. The girl turned to her mentor and remarked that she was coming to the conclusion that Kade was a very sweet and kind girl. The protagonist asked her, "So what?" Yukinoshita told him that it was nothing. It was just that when she saw them there in the hallway, when Kade was hugging him, and he patted her head in return, she felt strange at the sight. The protagonist looked at her with interest. He remembered that situation. Kade hugged him and told him they did it. Then she asked him if he was hurt. He took off his gloves and told her everything was fine. He was glad they had succeeded, after which he stroked her hair. And now he told Yukinoshita he was just glad no one was hurt, so he relaxed for a minute. Don't let her get him wrong. A colleague noticed, right? It's just that when a girl gets stroked on the head, it means something. MC said in a serious tone. Something else was more important now. He wanted to ask her if she could take care of the girl if he wasn't around. Yukinoshita answered him that she had nothing against it, but if he said that, it meant he was going to help Oda. The protagonist said that was true. He owed him a favor, and he needed to repay it. He got ready to go. Kade grabbed him by the shirt and asked him where he was going. The protagonist told her he needed to talk to Oda. He was waiting for him. He'd be back after that. He turned to his colleague and apologized for dumping everything on her so quickly. Yukinoshita told him it was fine. That was just him, her mentor. The protagonist glanced at her sideways and left. The girl hugged Kade and told her that her older sister would be entertaining her from now on. She added that they had so much to talk about. Kade accepted her words with a smile. As the protagonist walked down the hallway, he thought, Yukinoshita was the youngest in their group, but she was very kind and always had a knack for connecting with people. He could confidently entrust the girl to her. Meanwhile, his colleague told Kade that because of her mentor, she had to constantly work overtime. That day, she returned home on time, but she was so tired that she fell asleep immediately after washing and changing. She remembers putting her phone on silent, even turning off the alarm, as it would go off at the slightest noise. So, she had no idea what was happening outside. She woke up in the middle of the night and went out onto the veranda. Seeing a human silhouette at that hour was already strange. And these people were still walking in the middle of the road, swaying from side to side. The moment she realized the strangeness of the situation, she heard screams. She thought something was wrong. After that, she immediately grabbed her phone and started searching for information. That's how she learned about the pandemic. She immediately started calling her friends and family. After some time, she came across a letter saying that the mayor's office had become a shelter for survivors. She tried to contact her mentor, but she couldn't get through or receive a reply. Then the internet and mobile service were cut off and her food supplies were dwindling. She was cornered. The last time she contacted her family, they told her to wait for help. But she felt like she was reaching her limit, and just as she was about to pack her backpack to leave, she was surprised to hear a sound coming from the veranda. Peeking out, Yukinoshita was horrified to see a zombie peering onto the veranda. It was her neighbor. They often crossed paths. She was a student, but she didn't even know her name. Her lifeless face, her cloudy eyes, it was terrifying. She paused through the glass between the verandas, not caring that shards of glass were sticking out of her stomach, and she moved completely unnaturally. On the internet, they were called infected. Yukinoshita forgot about her backpack and her phone. She ran to the door and put on her new running shoes. As soon as she closed the door behind her, she heard the sound of breaking glass. She really didn't want to check what was happening behind her. She ran through the back streets, trying to avoid other infected. Gradually, she felt them breathing down her neck. And when she reached City Hall, she saw a man on the roof, attracting the attention of the infected. And from the window of the police station hung a ladder. Next to Yukinoshita were two people, a man and a woman, surrounded by the infected. The man tried to protect the wounded woman, but he failed. At that moment, Yukinoshita, was completely calm. Without a trace of guilt, she thought this was her chance. She heard the man and woman being torn apart, and yet she escaped anyway. Grabbing the ladder, she began to desperately climb up. Everything would be okay. That was the only thought that comforted her. Suddenly, she felt someone grab her leg. They were infected, trying to pull her down. She was lucky. They grabbed her by the sneaker that had fallen off. Lucky she got out of the house. Lucky she hadn't grabbed a backpack, which would only have slowed her down. Lucky she was able to shake off the sneaker the infected had latched onto. And lucky, she came across strangers who helped her reach the stairs. Yukinoshita continued. And from then on, everything went the same way for her. For Kade, Oda helped her. They examined her body, and she felt she could survive here. The girl, who had been listening to her so attentively, replied that she had been through horror. Yukinoshita agreed, adding that she too had been through similar things at such a young age. The girl added that she would not ask her about anything if she did not want to talk about it, but she needed to at least speak her heart out. Kade admitted that Yukinoshita was right. The girl told her she'd been hurt and scared, but Mr. Azami had helped her a lot, and she'd even met her. Yukinoshita looked at her fondly and remarked, "She's so sweet. It must have been hard for her to spend day after day in the company of this unfeeling protagonist, right?" Kade countered, "Not at all. When she was completely alone, she was afraid of every sound, especially at night. But with the protagonist by her side, she could sleep soundly, unafraid of the coming of tomorrow." Kade saw the protagonist's colleague's puzzled expression and corrected herself. Don't let her think anything bad. Nothing had happened between them. He was simply protecting her. Yukinoshita smiled and suggested she tell her everything from this point on in more detail. Meanwhile, the protagonist asked Oda what he wanted to talk to him about. The policeman replied that he was simply incredible. Seeing Azami's puzzled expression, Oda said he'd apologize to him during his first visit to their hideout. He had a lot to apologize for, too. First, let him forgive him for not helping him bring that child here. The protagonist protested, saying there was no need to apologize for that. It was logical. If he'd gone with them and gotten hurt transporting Kade, the refugees' peaceful lives could have been in jeopardy. He'd told him from the start, Oda, that he didn't need his help. The policeman had told him he thought the MC would say that. The man continued. But there was something else he truly wanted to apologize for. Back when he'd first told him about that girl, and when he'd left after gathering provisions, he'd wanted to tell him, was it worth saving her? Risking everything he had? That's what he was thinking. It was clear Oda was feeling very awkward, ashamed. The protagonist noted that everything was clear to him. Oda continued, but such thoughts likely hadn't even occurred to him, and his plan had gone off without a hitch. The policeman paused briefly and said he truly was sorry. Azami told him not to apologize. He didn't care. At the moment, he was simply surprised he'd even brought it up. Oda thanked him for his understanding. He added that his defense of the shelter was a kind of atonement. The protagonist asked in surprise, "Atonement?" Oda told him that on the day the pandemic first began, he abandoned many civilians. Everyone rushed out into the streets at once, hoping for help, but he quickly closed the doors in their faces and drove them all away. By then, the infected were already roaming the streets, and those people became their snack. Several of his comrades were bitten by zombies when they were forced outside. They tried to cure them, but by morning, they were no longer human. He killed them with his own hands. The protagonist looked around the empty room, where life had recently been in full swing, and answered Oda that it was not his fault. The protagonist added that he simply had no choice. He did what he had to do. The police officer continued, attempting to atone for his sin by turning the station into a safe house and spreading the news online. That same day, many people flocked to the area, but none of them made it safely. Some were killed, some were bitten while climbing the stairs, and some arrived already wounded. He sadly added that he had personally killed the latter. He thought about how to secure the path to the stairs, thought and thought, searching for the infected's behavior patterns. Through trial and error, they arrived at what he, the MC, had seen. But by that point, many had died. Oda bowed his head and noted that he had written about this place becoming a safe house. Come to think of it, this act was also one of his sins. The protagonist said he'll say it again, that it's not his fault. The fact that there are survivors is the result of his, Oda's, hard work, and he's grateful. Yukinoshita, Kade, and everyone else, they're all alive thanks to him, so what's wrong with that? Oda said his name gratefully. The protagonist thought about it. In another world, he too had abandoned many people to certain death, far more than Oda could have imagined. They had similar experiences, and initially he felt the same way Oda did now, but then he simply got used to it. He stopped thinking of it as a sin. Comparing them, MC began to feel inferior, and in a way, guilty towards him, and all this mixed with self-loathing. Oda looks at him with tears in his eyes, like a lost lamb hearing the voice of God. But he, the protagonist, is not so noble, and he cannot judge him or forgive him for anything. Yes, he told him it wasn't his fault, that he had no choice, that he did what he had to do. Perhaps this is what the protagonist wanted to tell himself. He had killed far more than Oda. He was the one who would suffer on the other side. MC looked closely at his interlocutor and silently asked him not to look at him like that. The two men's remorse was heard in the complete silence. Several days had passed since Kade's arrival at the shelter and conversation with Oda. Today was the day of another supply run. The bald man told the protagonist he was really cool. The man added that he'd seen him fighting those zombies during the evacuation. He laughed and remarked that he was happy that someone like him was working with them. The second man added that frankly, they were always short on people. The protagonist told them there was no need to praise him. Oda and everyone else were simply amazing. As the allies set out, Baldy asked the protagonist if he'd returned to the shelter with some girl. Hadn't he? The protagonist replied that he had. He added that she was currently under the care of his apprentice from his previous job. He'd visited them in his free time, and there was always a feminine atmosphere there. Baldy remarked that he was even starting to feel envious. He added, yeah, but if he had to deal with this every day, he'd get a headache. The other one laughed and said he'd have the same problem. The protagonist responded, you could say that. He thought about it. Kade had become friends with Yukinoshita, and she had excellent relationships with the other refugees. She's the youngest in this shelter, so everyone was worried about her. He'd already considered letting her sleep in the same room with him if she felt uncomfortable, but Yukinoshita eased his burden when she offered to let the girl share her room. Although it took him a long time to explain to her later that he hadn't intended anything bad, it was better to live alone. For example, he could slip out unnoticed. He was grateful that the windows in his third-floor room were hidden from the patrol. It made it even easier. Nothing would have happened if Kade had been in the same room with him. Yukinoshita's room was also within range of his skill. He could react to any danger without leaving his room. And even while he wasn't there, he knew that together they could handle any worries. Entrusting Kade to Yukinoshita's care had been a good idea, and now he could fully focus on helping Oda. That day of their conversation, had he been able to ease his suffering in any way? Any words of support from someone like him, weren't they just empty words? He might always act optimistic, but he carried a lot of grief, and he, the protagonist, wanted to help him bear that burden. He wanted to be useful, so he was glad he'd been able to join the grocery run. This trip was made so much safer simply by being with them. He really hoped it would help ease his guilty conscience. At that moment, a message came over Baldy's radio that they'd arrived at the recently discovered supermarket. The front gate was closed, as before, but there was a problem. The back gate, which they'd personally closed, was now open. There was no sign of a zombie influx yet. Oda suggested the allies go inside but leave the gates open just yet. First, they needed to survey the surrounding area and clear everything. He asked them if everyone understood. His subordinates and the protagonist replied that they understood. The protagonist thought, quick reaction, clear and precise instructions. He too should take up his role. He told his allies to remain vigilant and jump off the car. Activating one of his skills, MC saw that there were 9 zombies inside the warehouse. He told Baldy that he saw 5 infected approaching them. 2 were at the delivery point, and 2 more were in the passageway. The protagonist thought that while it wasn't necessary to tell them the location of all the zombies, they needed to get rid of the ones closest to them as quickly as possible. The allies prepared to repel the onslaught of infected, who quickly appeared near their car. Teaming up with a police squad, they successfully disposed of everyone approaching the back of the car and ensured their safe departure. The second exclaimed, even in this darkness, they're doing it. Baldy told the protagonist that he had amazing eyesight. They saw that zombies were advancing on them again. The second one spoke up. The protagonist truly is amazing. MC gripped his axe tighter and shouted to his allies to keep up the good work. While dispatching the infected, the protagonist thought there's nothing amazing about him. He simply brought power from another world here. Without it, he'd be powerless, sitting in a corner, shaking with fear. That day, when he first arrived in another world, he'd had to force himself to suppress his fear of zombies, not just for himself, but for those he fought for. Now, these guys, with whom he fights zombies side by side, are much more amazing and more worthy of respect. Oda informed them that they'd done a great job. The entrance was clear. Now they could close the gates and search the supermarket. He warned everyone to be careful. Someone had definitely been here before them. Walking down the corridor, the protagonist noticed another zombie approaching from a blind spot near the pickup point. He thought that even though his skill revealed the location of all the zombies, he couldn't simply tell them. especially if a zombie was approaching from a blind spot. The protagonist decided to go ahead to scout the situation. It looked more natural and minimized the risks. After all, if one of the guys went ahead, things could end badly for them. And since, according to his allies, he could see well even in the dark, they let him go first, without further ado. The other police officers continued to search the room, while the protagonist went ahead. After a short while, he called Oda and showed him something strange. An infected man lay before them, his body covered in gunshot wounds, surrounded by empty shell casings. Oda examined the body and declared that those were bullet holes, the second man said, perplexed. All their employees kill infected with axes. They don't use pistols or shotguns for such things. Oda said that it seemed someone else besides them was trying to get rid of the infected, but with firearms. He added that they'd better quickly load all the supplies they'd found into the truck and get out of here. The station chief turned to the protagonist and said something told him that these squires might not be very peaceable. They might have to fight them. He should cover their backs so they wouldn't catch them off guard. The protagonist was about to object, but Oda glared at him, and the MC replied that his orders had been received. Looking around, the protagonist saw empty shelves and realized things were bad. No food, no water, nothing left. Everything had been taken clean. Oda remarked that it was good that at least they hadn't encountered anyone. Judging by the amount of supplies they'd managed to take away, a whole gang had been operating here. The protagonist silently agreed with him. When they finally found some supplies and loaded them into the truck, Oda said it should last them for a while, but they should forage for supplies elsewhere from now on. The protagonist told him he was right about that. Oda continued that it was good that they'd arrived early this time and were lucky. At least there was something left. Now they just needed to figure out where to look for supplies next time. Having said this, the site commander laughed sadly, and he continued to laugh on the way to the base and during the raid. They soon reached the site and safely drove the trucks in. The guard greeted them and welcomed them back. Oda acknowledged his words and remarked that they'd had a bountiful haul today. Could they help unload? While sorting through the goods, the site manager dictated to the guards that they had canned goods, spices, snacks, and sweets with long expiration dates, and all sorts of other small items. There was enough bottled water for a week. He added that they'd loaded up at a well-known store today, but there was nothing else to catch there, so they'd have to figure out where to get more. He ordered the snacks and sweets to be distributed to those who needed them most. The guard replied that he understood. Oda, holding a large box in his hands, said that they'd also managed to secure some medicine and bedding. Just in case, they'd also taken fuel, as well as several batteries, solar panels, and portable generators. He mentioned that this was all in case their little helper needed more power. The protagonist asked who he was talking about. Oda smiled and told him he was talking about the portable drone. He showed the device to the protagonist and said they used it to deliver food to the mayor's office. The MC asked him where they'd managed to get such a treasure. The precinct chief said he'd taken it from the confiscated goods warehouse. He added that it was a good thing he'd managed to learn how to use it while the internet was still working. From time to time, during yet another zombie outbreak, a person would appear on the roof of the city hall. This meant they needed supplies, food in particular. In exchange, they helped them monitor the situation and guard the area. Oda smiled and said that thanks to this symbiosis, they could continue their raids as before, but with fewer losses. Previously, in critical situations, they had to rescue people using rope ladders. The protagonist replied that everything was clear to him now. At that moment, the second man turned to Oda and reported that the systems were operational and the drone was ready to depart. The precinct chief responded that this was excellent news. He should check that the food box was securely fastened. The second man checked everything and activated the drone. As the craft took off, the infected saw it. The protagonist ventured a guess that the mayor's office had once had a decent food supply, but for some reason it had become insufficient. Oda replied that it had simply become much more difficult to replenish supplies. Consider water, for example. In the current circumstances, even such a valuable resource should be handled with care. He showed the protagonist the roof of the mayor's office and told him that there were water tanks installed there, as well as on the roof of the police department. But people don't consider the possibility of running out and continue to use as much as they are accustomed to. The police department was particularly affected by this problem. They had significantly more people there, so it's no surprise that the water supply quickly began to run out. And there was little that could be done about it. The man on the roof of the city hall signaled to them that the cargo had been delivered without any problems. Suddenly, something caught the protagonist's attention. In an instant, the crowd of zombies below them looked up at the sky, but their gaze wasn't fixed on the drone. The protagonist remembered that zombies have more sensitive hearing than normal humans. Therefore, they reacted to what was happening much earlier than he or Oda. Only a little later did the sound reach his ears. By then, everyone had heard it. The bald man looked through his binoculars and turned to his captain, informing him that it was a military helicopter. Everyone was surprised to see a huge helicopter approaching them, its enormous blades creating a vortex of wind. Yukinoshita and Kade peered out the window in surprise. The protagonist wondered if the long-awaited blessing and deliverance was flying toward them, or if it was quite the opposite. Captain Oda exclaimed with a smile, "A military helicopter. It's a military helicopter. So the soldiers are still alive. Had they really come to rescue them?" MC carefully observed his emotions, and in that moment, he admired Oda's fortitude even more. He always thought of others more than himself. He watched the rescue helicopter land on the roof of City Hall. A soldier emerged and contacted Oda by radio. They discussed the police department, City Hall, and the rescued people currently in the shelter. After the conversation, Oda addressed everyone and announced that he was rushing to inform them that a military helicopter had arrived and was ready to take the survivors on board. The soldiers assured him that they had room for everyone. However, they also reported that the current fuel supply was only enough to transport everyone currently in City Hall to safety. The evacuation of government employees was currently the military's top priority. He, the captain and head of the police station, asked everyone to be understanding of this situation. The protagonist heard people's worries, expressing hope that the helicopter would return. If so, they would be saved together. MC thought, contrary to his expectations, everyone took the news quite well. That day, everyone came out to see off the rapidly departing helicopter carrying the people from City Hall. The protagonist believed this situation once again proved how much everyone trusted Oda, and he was once again convinced of what wonderful people lived here. Yukinoshita asked him if they were saved. He answered that they were. The girl turned to Kade and said, "Does she see and hear this?" The girl told her that they owed a lot to Azami and the people from the shelter. They treated them so well. She was so happy about it. Yukinoshita hugged Kade and remarked, "But let's not forget what the protagonist has done for them too. He's been so caring about them all this time." She added, "How sweet she is." The protagonist, watching them, told them that they were celebrating too soon. He added that besides their shelter, there were plenty of others where people were also waiting to be rescued. So the military would arrive, at best, the day after tomorrow, at worst, in a week, or even later. They just had to hold out until they returned. Yukinoshita told him that they were aware of this. Nevertheless, the situation was not going well. Oda was unusually irritated and kept exclaiming, "Where have they gone? Why weren't they coming back for them?" A week had passed since the military's arrival, but the helicopter still hadn't returned for them. Luckily, there was still enough food and water for everyone, but it was dwindling, meaning they'd soon need to be replenished. Now, however, they also had to worry about reinforcements arriving during their foray into supplies. In this limbo, with no one knowing where to turn, Oda and the group of police department survivors began to feel despondent. Meanwhile, the situation in the shelter was growing tense. Problems that everyone had previously tactfully kept quiet about suddenly began to surface. But that wasn't surprising. The protagonist reflected that when he first arrived here, he felt lost, and these powers bestowed upon him by another world were a little disconcerting. If he could use them without drawing unnecessary attention to himself, most of Oda's problems would vanish in an instant. However, he couldn't use them if any military personnel were nearby. Besides, it was probably too late to do anything. Strange rumors would surely spread about him. At the very least, someone would ask why he hadn't mentioned his capabilities earlier. Azami approached the captain and said he apologized for informing him so late, but the car he and Kade had driven here in contained some supplies. They had stocked up on them, just in case. He added that if anything was missing from the shelter, he asked them to take their supplies. Oda looked at him carefully and asked if he was sure about that. The protagonist pointed out that he had already told him they had stocked up on them, just in case. So he was counting on those supplies ending up here anyway. Oda said thoughtfully, "Is that so?" So it seemed like he'd been collecting them for a long time. The protagonist admitted that was true. It might sound strange, but he hadn't mentioned it because he was afraid. He apologized again for being so late. Oda sheepishly replied that he had nothing to apologize for. The captain thanked the protagonist and said they would certainly find a use for them. He added that perhaps if there were enough provisions in the trunk, they could replenish their supplies. The protagonist replied that it would be so. At that moment, Azami decided to take the blow himself. He thought perhaps this way he could keep Oda and the others safe. After all, the captain would certainly have tried to stop him if he'd known about this earlier, but he wouldn't have listened. MC placed his hand on the precinct commander's shoulder and noted that as soon as the supplies ran out, they would replenish them with what was in his car. He added that for now, all they could do was wait. Oda thoughtfully said that they would do just that. But right now, he was more concerned about something else. What to do with the military. He'd understood from their conversations that they wouldn't be able to take them right away, but they hadn't contacted them since. The protagonist thought for some reason he had a bad feeling. Maybe he should go and check for himself? After a while, he looked out the window and noted that it was already the middle of the night. Except for the guards, everyone at the post was already asleep. It was drizzling outside, the perfect time for a secret raid. But first he made sure the door to the room was securely locked. The protagonist donned his helmet, pulled on his gloves, and set about his task. As soon as he managed to get out of sight of the guards, he immediately jumped down. Luckily, he had checked the exact location of the central military base on the map beforehand. Of course, it was quite far away, and if he didn't catch anyone's eye, he would likely make it back before dawn. Azami used his acceleration and rushed forward. After a while, he stopped near the object and thought, "The central military base, it seems like it's here." Upon closer inspection, he realized he was right. Leaping onto the fence wall, he froze in surprise. His magically enhanced vision revealed hordes of mindless zombies roaming the inner grounds. As he could tell, The base was surrounded on all sides by a wall at least 2 meters high. The steel gates that topped it were securely locked. He noted that there were no signs of forced entry or destruction. The barricade was quite secure. Everything pointed to another outbreak of a pandemic occurring here. The protagonist thought it looked ridiculous. Could the military really be so careless as to allow such a slip-up? He always thought the fire department should have checked people for injuries far more thoroughly than even the police. But be that as it may, it seemed he would have to get inside and take a look around. Perhaps there were still survivors there, so he should be more careful to avoid unnecessary clashes between them. He decided to see how large the building was. Carefully making his way inside, he entered rooms that looked like barracks. Judging by the numerous beds and other equipment, he confirmed that there were no survivors here. Then he made his way into the gym. It seemed to him that everything here was just like at school. The protagonist looked around and noticed that here and there were still traces of people's presents, dishes, and other small items, but there was no one here either. Behind the gym, the protagonist discovered a tent camp. Peering into one of the tents, he discovered pocket knives, sleeping bags, and kerosene lamps. Apparently, the military had housed the evacuees inside the building, while they themselves spent the night in tents outside. Leaving the tent, MC was surprised to find tire tracks on the asphalt. Their direction indicated that the military had moved toward the sea. Following the tracks to the boat station, the protagonist saw a row of trucks parked in front of him, as if they were trying to form a defensive line. Therefore, it was highly likely that the military had grabbed the boats and simply driven off somewhere. At the very least, it hardly resembled a disappearance without a trace. The protagonist became curious about where exactly the military had gone. Just in case, he decided to check the base again. He was unable to detect any signs of life. With that, he decided to end the investigation and return to the shelter. On his way back, MC analyzed what he had seen. Why had the outbreak occurred precisely where people were being examined? After all, the military's protocol for discovering injuries was far stricter and more severe. He hadn't thought such serious people would take such an important matter so lightly. The only thing he now realized was that, in this scenario, hoping for the soldiers' rescue was as futile as waiting for the sun to fall. The protagonist reasoned that since they had set off so quickly, they must have already prepared boats with supplies. They had also probably carefully thought out their destination. It was unlikely that after something like this, they would abandon everything, valiantly jump into helicopters, and rush to the aid of the remaining survivors. The protagonist also noticed that among the infected wandering around the base, there were negligible numbers of soldiers. However, almost all of them had wounds on their bodies, typical of those usually received in war. The area itself was littered with signs of a struggle. He wondered if they'd only managed to formulate an escape plan, but hadn't prepared for the actual evacuation properly. Regardless, he knew he couldn't just tell Oda this, but if he couldn't find peace and tried to find the base himself, he'd have to gather his courage and tell the captain everything. Azami was determined to follow him unquestioningly to the very end. It seemed to him the best option. 2 days had passed since the protagonist's foray into the base. As before, he was on guard duty with some other subordinates. Suddenly, he had a vague suspicion that someone was watching them, and judging by his feelings, someone hostile. The danger clearly wasn't coming from the roof of the police department. Perhaps it was something inside. The protagonist realized it was definitely not a zombie, but one of the survivors. Perhaps it wasn't inside, but most likely near the building. His gut instinct told him there was no serious cause for concern yet. It looked like no one was planning to attack them just yet, but there was a chance it was one of the recent arrivals. He thought that if his guess was correct, they could be in big trouble. The next day, MC came to the roof to see the guards. The bald one asked him, surprised, why he was there. After all, it wasn't his turn to be on duty today. The protagonist replied that he needed some fresh air. He added that the weather was perfect. The protagonist asked him if help had arrived yet. The bald one answered with bewilderment that no one was there. He wondered if perhaps something had happened to them on the road. Azami muttered, probably. He was overcome by that feeling again, just like yesterday. It emanated from the building across the street. He thought it was odd that he'd felt nothing of the sort when the military helicopter arrived. And just like every time strangers visited them, come to think of it, who could possibly wish them harm? What was this person's purpose? The protagonist had a gut feeling that this person was acting alone, but who was he? Perhaps he'd snuck into the shelter long before, perhaps while everyone was asleep. Although the abilities that allowed him, the protagonist, to sense such things, he still didn't know what to do with them. Getting rid of an ill-wisher for no apparent reason would be, to say the least, strange. Still, this is still Japan, albeit a much changed one. The protagonist decided it would be better to follow the commandment not to kill than to resort to violence. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by a bald man. He called out to the MC, and looking through binoculars, he pointed the way, saying that a car had just driven down the main street. It was heading for the building's parking lot. The protagonist wondered in confusion, "Are there any more survivors?" Suddenly, sounds like gunshots were heard inside the building. The bald man, shouting that he heard gunshots, rushed for the exit, calling on the protagonist to follow him to the stairs. Running toward the sound, the MC saw Oda and another police officer pointing their guns at someone. The captain extended his hand toward the protagonist and told him to step back. The protagonist saw Oda and his assistant holding a blonde guy at gunpoint. It was Thomas. The boy muttered in bewilderment, "Isn't this a shelter?" Oda yelled at him to stay still, and then they wouldn't hurt him. He added that they would take his gun away for now. Thomas, playing dumb, asked them, "This is a shelter, right?" He wasn't planning on doing anything. Oda repeated again to him to stay still and raised his hands. The protagonist, watching this, thought the boy hadn't even resisted when they took his gun. Maybe the gunshots were coming from him shooting at zombies? If he had harmed any of the local inhabitants, panic would surely have erupted. Fortunately, the protagonist didn't detect any unrest on their part. The impulses were very weak. However, Azami saw the look Thomas gave him and Oda, filled with hatred. The captain, going through the boy's collected belongings, listed what was there: a radio, a penknife, and another hunting knife. He turned to Thomas, apologized, and said they would have to confiscate it all. The boy exclaimed in surprise, "And the radio too?" But this was his only way to keep in touch with his friends. Why couldn't he keep it? Oda, smiling, assured him they would handle it with care. He added that if he had any objections, he couldn't help him. He was free to leave this place whenever he wanted, even now. Thomas's demeanor faded, and he said he understood and agreed with everything. The protagonist turned to the captain and told him to be careful with this visitor. Oda replied that he didn't like him either. He didn't know why, but he found him extremely suspicious. Sometime later, as the captain and the protagonist walked down the hallway, Oda admitted he even regretted the guy not leaving. He remarked that it was probably selfish of him. The protagonist countered that he wasn't. He'd said everything correctly. He noted that if this guy had anything to do with the corpses in the supermarket, they were in deep trouble. But that would explain why he had a knife and a radio with him. The protagonist added that it seemed plausible. He thought, looking at his comrade, that without any special training, Oda couldn't easily recognize danger. However, right now he'd voiced what MC was thinking, and then it became clear why he was carrying a radio. Azami couldn't describe how impressed he was that the captain had so clearly and quickly grasped the situation, even though he wasn't on the observation deck at the time. Oda went out to the observation post and said that, in the end, the helicopter never arrived. He noticed that things weren't going so well. The protagonist told him there was nothing he could do about it. Azami added that he would also try to keep an eye on this guy, if possible. The captain thanked him for his help. Afterwards, the protagonist approached the girls. He told them about the strange guy, and added that they should be more careful. Kade asked him if this meant there was a new person in their shelter. Yukinoshita looked closely at the protagonist. He told the girl, "Unfortunately, that's true." Kade said with bewilderment. He might seem intimidating, all in black, with all those piercings, but she'd seen how friendly he was with other people, how he interacted with everyone so easily and naturally. The protagonist replied that at first glance, perhaps that was true. Most likely, he was very good at what he said, as they say. But judging from his personal experience, you can't always trust what people see. Some things aren't immediately obvious, and he might just be a good actor. They were surprised, and the protagonist continued. Oda also thinks that you need to be careful with this guy. So they should try not to be alone, and they should also lock the room. He added, and once it gets dark, they shouldn't open the door to anyone. Is that clear to them? The allies replied that they understood. He thought they'd been wary and somewhat distrustful of his words at first. But once he mentioned the gun and the shots, they immediately understood the reason for his concern for them. He sensed a strange aura emanating from this guy. It was so strong that the protagonist could feel it from several rooms away. Because of this, he remained vigilant even at night. But fortunately, this guy didn't do anything that might arouse suspicion. Meanwhile, the protagonist continued to stand guard on the roof, but everything was the same there, and he had no idea what to do with all this. 3 days had passed since the strange man's arrival at their hideout. After some time, Oda, having prepared the truck, told the protagonist that he didn't have to go with them, they could handle it themselves. He replied that everything was fine, they had nothing to worry about. That day, they were planning to resupply, taking some supplies from MC's car. Oda commanded the bald man to move forward. Their plan was to first drive their regular supply truck to the abandoned car. Then the protagonist would transfer to it and drive it back to the hideout. The truck would follow. Oda was reluctant to have the protagonist participate in this until the very end. However, no one else volunteered, and he, on the contrary, volunteered. So the captain was forced to retreat. Now that the mayor's office was empty, there was no one to report the zombie situation on the streets, so they decided to attach a smartphone to the drone they were using to transport supplies and turn up the music, trying to distract the zombies with an external stimulus. After a while, the bald man exclaimed in confusion. It seemed it hadn't worked. What should they do now? The protagonist told him to drive a little closer and stop the car. When his comrade did so, the protagonist said it would do. He kicked away an infected who was trying to approach the car, jumped out of the back, and ran toward the abandoned vehicle with an axe. Along the way, he destroyed several zombies that tried to attack him. Opening the car, MC heard the bald man call out a warning, spun around, and used an axe to destroy an infected who was about to attack him from behind. Then a second zombie. When he finally got behind the wheel, he remarked over the radio that this was how they lived. But they needed to get back to their original route. The bald man exclaimed in admiration, "Wow, he's a cool guy." Having retrieved the car, they immediately wanted to head back, but they didn't rush as their actions could easily attract the zombies' attention. To avoid trailing a trail of infected, they decided to circle the area. The plan worked. The zombies initially gave chase, but they quickly fell behind. They soon returned to the garage without any problems. Oda was delighted to see the huge amount of supplies. There were so many of them that they even had to remove the back seat to fit everything in, as the trunk wouldn't hold everything. Baldy, meanwhile, couldn't stop delightedly recounting to the captain all the protagonist's exploits during the trip. The protagonist felt very uneasy. After that, MC left Oda and his subordinates in the garage and headed to the residential building. He couldn't shake the uneasiness of the new man's presence. So for his own peace of mind, he decided to make sure everything was all right. Suddenly, he felt a sixth sense telling him that the guy was right now in the same room with Kade, and they were completely alone. He rushed to the girl's room and yanked the door open. What he saw there told him his premonition was right. Kade was lying on the floor, her clothes carelessly pulled up, and Thomas was leaning over her with a knife in his hands. At that moment, the girl thought how stupid she had been. The protagonist warned her about this, but even that couldn't protect her. While the male members of the shelter were executing the plan to retrieve the supplies from the car, the women were trying to find a new location for future resupply. When they reported over the radio that Azami had successfully completed the mission, she felt a sense of relief, and in order not to distract Yukinoshita from her conversation with a rather stern-looking woman, she decided to quickly run to the restroom alone. That's when she encountered Thomas. He exclaimed, "Oh, is that her, Kade?" The girl sheepishly asked him what he was doing near this room. It wasn't his. Thomas approached her and told her he'd simply entered the wrong door. She looked at him in confusion. The boy suddenly pulled a knife from his pocket, held it to Kade's throat and ordered her to quickly enter the room. He warned her not to scream. Kade fearfully asked him why he was doing this. He pushed her to the floor and told her rudely to shut her mouth. Didn't he tell her to be quiet? The guy locked the door and said, "Oh shit, I can't use the walkie-talkie, and the guards might see." What should he do? Thomas looked at the girl leeringly, licked his lips, and remarked, "Well, since she was here anyway, he'd play with her a little." The girl tried to resist, but the bastard hit her in the stomach, and she fell backwards to the floor. He began to approach her, threateningly warning her not to scream and not to resist him. Did she understand him? Kade tried to tell him she didn't like it. What was he doing? She felt so disgusted, so vile. And at that moment, the protagonist entered the room. This was the scene he saw. Thomas asked in shock. But how did he get here? Had the lock really broken? He held the knife to the girl's throat again and told the protagonist to remain silent and still. The bastard ordered the MC to carefully enter and close the door. Azami asked Kade to close her eyes for a moment. The girl did as the protagonist instructed. Thomas was indignant. He had clearly told them to remain silent, otherwise he would simply kill this girl. The boy didn't understand what happened next. He felt as if something had penetrated him, and he was instantly incapacitated. The protagonist, sitting on top of him and pinning his arms, told the girl she could open her eyes. Thomas cursed and threatened to kill Azami. The protagonist grabbed his head with his hand, pinned it to the floor, and told him to shut his mouth. He added that it was his turn to give orders. Besides, he'd ask that idiot questions, and he'd answer, but only in a whisper, unless he wanted to die right there. Kade, still shaken, couldn't even understand what the protagonist was asking Thomas. She remained sitting on the floor, locked in the room with the two men. She could only watch as Thomas whispered something in the protagonist's ear. Azami's face was so close, but she couldn't see it. MC asked her if she was okay. Kade looked at him, wondering if it was wrong to think that way about the protagonist, who had always been so kind to her, but now he looked so scary. Sometime later, Thomas was put behind bars. He indignantly asked Oda what they were going to do with him. The captain replied that it would be fine if he told them everything. The boy, perplexed, asked him what he should tell them. He already did it. He told everything he knows. Yes, he is to blame. He himself does not know what came over him. He already said that. The protagonist said in a nasty tone of voice how tired they were of his lies. Thomas suddenly hiccuped in fear. Sometime later, when the allies left the cell, Oda told the protagonist that he was very much at fault. The protagonist replied that everyone was busy gathering supplies, so everything was fine. He thought gloomily, which couldn't be said about Kade. He was only glad that the worst-case scenario had finally passed. Although, of course, it sounded so-so. Azami asked Oda what exactly the boy had told him. The captain had told him everything briefly, Before putting Thomas behind bars, the captain and his subordinates thoroughly interrogated him. According to Oda, the bastard waited until the guards left, and then he snuck into the other rooms and began searching them. And the knife he had threatened the girl with apparently came into his possession that way. The captain continued, apparently not intending to rob anyone, but merely trying to find a working radio. Afterward, he planned to get outside and contact his comrades. As it turned out, their group's original purpose in coming here was to scout out the situation within the police department. Thomas described himself as a man under duress, telling them he'd been sent there practically by force. And because they'd confiscated his radio so inopportunely, he'd been forced to quickly come up with a new plan. However, Kade happened to be nearby at the wrong time and immediately noticed that he was acting extremely suspiciously. Oda concluded his story, noting that at least now they knew he wasn't alone. However, their sudden captive had refused to reveal the location of their secret hideout, not because he didn't want to, he simply didn't know. Their group moves periodically, so the only way to find out their current location is to contact them directly by radio. The protagonist thought, so that's how it is. He hadn't given away either the client or the location of the hideout after all, just as the protagonist wanted. He wondered how he had behaved when Oda's men tried to dismantle him. Had he experienced the same terror as when he saw him? Azami thought about his ability, domination, a skill that heightens the victim's sense of fear while simultaneously depriving them of the ability to act voluntarily. That's why, at that moment, he needed to make sure Kade wouldn't fall under its influence. Only then did he activate domination, channeling all his power into the intended target. And then, in the blink of an eye, he was at his side, using his speed-boosting skill. The guy didn't even have time to process what was happening. To him, it was as if the protagonist had suddenly vanished into thin air. Under such intense pressure, overcome with uncontrollable fear, he spilled all the information he had. So, the protagonist was perfectly aware of the location of their gang's hideout, who their leader was, and even the approximate number of guards inside. The only thing was, he wasn't sure Oda would be able to use this information, so he warned Thomas beforehand to keep his mouth shut. Of course, he also warned Thomas about MC's abilities. As for the scumbags gang, the protagonist would personally take care of them tonight. Having waited until nightfall, the protagonist donned his helmet again, pulled on his gloves, and rushed toward his target. There were two people in the building, Thomas's partners. One of them remarked that they shouldn't have sent the guy there. The other pointed out that he was right. If they had come up with a backup plan, they wouldn't have had to hang around here forever. Suddenly, they heard footsteps, aimed a gun, and shouted, "Who's there?" The protagonist appeared before them, fully equipped. They asked him, confused, who he was. Was he a new member of their team? One of them grabbed a stick and struck the protagonist in the leg. Azami played along, dropping to one knee. The bandit struck him again, and the protagonist fell to his knees. The leader told his comrade that he was unlikely to be a newcomer. If he were, he would have told them his code word. If so, he should finish him off quickly. The bandit replied that he understood and raised his hand to strike. The protagonist grabbed his hand and squeezed it hard. The bandit screamed that it hurt. MC twisted his arm so hard that he tore it off. The bandit fell to the floor, bleeding profusely, screaming in pain. The leader jumped up, pointed his gun at the protagonist, and exclaimed, "What the hell is going on here?" The protagonist, holding the bandit's severed arm, told the leader not to scream. He added that it was even better that they were such scum. He would deal with them without any remorse. He continued ominously, and now it was time for the interrogation. If he didn't want to suffer too much before his death, he advised him to answer quickly and clearly. The leader asked him in bewilderment, "Who the hell is he?" MC, ignoring his question, asked him, "Aside from them, who else is in their hideout?" The leader stuttered that there was no one else here. Azami grinned incredulously. "Is that true? And what? They don't even hold any kidnapped women captive?" The leader blurted out that they definitely didn't have any living women. The protagonist thought, so there was no need to search the entire building. However, if he were in the place of the two guys who were making their living as murderers, he wouldn't have spilled the beans, no matter who stood before him. He grabbed the gang leader by the shoulder and said that everything he was saying sounded right so far, but it wouldn't hurt to make sure. He, as the gang leader, understood that if everything he was saying turned out to be wrong, he would die painfully, and for a very long time. The gang leader begged him not to rush. To the protagonist's surprise, he asked him to first behead his wounded partner, and then let him go wherever he wanted. His partner was already dead, no matter what. The MC looked at him in confusion. What was he talking about? The gang leader told him he'd heard that if a person dies, they become one of the zombies and start attacking everyone, so he begs him to quickly behead his partner. The protagonist noticed the movement of the one the gang leader was talking about and wondered in surprise. What had this undead body suddenly come back to life? The gang leader screamed in horror, begging him to do something with this body already. The protagonist dealt the risen man a powerful blow with a stick and crushed his head with his foot. He thought, one zombie is ready, but why did this guy suddenly become like this? How did this happen? So he was already bitten when he died. The leader told him that wasn't true. Everyone who dies becomes like this. They don't even need to be bitten. MC was surprised. No matter how he looked, the blonde guy was definitely a zombie. Even his skill identified him as such. Previously, he was sure that only those who had this effect transferred from other zombies became zombies. It didn't seem like the leader was lying to him. Perhaps he should question him further. After some thought, Azami decided he wouldn't interrogate him. He said, if only the others could see where this was all heading. He added that the leader shouldn't tell anyone that he was here. He should keep his mouth shut, otherwise he would find him anywhere, no matter how hard he tried to escape. Stepping outside, the protagonist thought that this so-called gang of anti-law enforcement had chosen the former shopping mall located nearby as a hideout. He jumped onto the roof of an abandoned car and suddenly found himself facing a gun. A man ordered him to stay put. He radioed his accomplices that they had a strange guy in their territory. They should send someone to help. The man asked the MC what he was doing here. Where did he even come from? The protagonist replied that he was there to finish them all off. The bandit chuckled, remarked that he wouldn't succeed, and shot at the protagonist. When he saw that the bullet hadn't struck him, he exclaimed in amazement, "What is that?" The protagonist, climbing up to the bandit, took a crowbar from the storage area and said that, in a situation like this, he should have thought about self-defense. Adjusting his weapon, Azami apologized, but added that he could consider him dead. The protagonist struck the bandit with lightning speed, slicing his body in half. The bandit briefly began to move. The protagonist thought, as he had predicted, that almost immediately afterward, the man had transformed into another walking zombie. It seemed the leader had told him the truth after all. MC struck the infected man, crushing his skull. Afterward, he heard the next bandit exclaim, "What kind of bastard did this?" Seeing the protagonist, the bandit informed his partners that their enemy was on the stairs. They needed to ambush him up there. Azami thought, so they'll all be waiting for him from above. So much the better. At least he'll save time. Climbing up, he stood facing the bandits. They started shooting at him from almost point-blank range. The protagonist grinned under his helmet. Fortunately, the suit he was wearing was imbued with a special magical energy, so neither rain nor bullets were a threat to him. The protagonist drew his weapon and dispatched almost all the bandits in one fell swoop. One managed to escape, screaming that this guy was a real monster. The protagonist followed him. Noticing that the bandit had disappeared around the corner, he said, "No one can hide from him." Approaching the bandit's ambush site, MC dealt him a powerful blow from around the corner, decapitating the enemy. Azami noticed another man from the gang. He approached him and said, "I think he's the last one left alive." The bandit asked him in a trembling voice who he was. Anyway, the MC replied that he was just a random passerby. He should forgive him for causing such a ruckus. But it hadn't gone well. The protagonist continued. Actually, he wanted to ask him a few questions. The two guarding the police station and everyone else who was here, were they all his comrades? Or were there more somewhere? The bandit replied that there was no one else. Azami asked him if they were the ones restocking supplies at the nearby supermarket. The man replied that they were indeed, the two of them. The protagonist asked one last question. Besides them, were there any other armed groups nearby? The bandit told him that the only people nearby besides them were the police. The protagonist noted, "I see." Well, then, he had nothing to worry about. The man replied that it was. He was about to ask the protagonist for help, but the protagonist blew his head off. Watching him, MC thought curiously how even decapitated, the bandit was starting to transform into a zombie. He stepped on his head and crushed it. He figured there was still time before dawn, so he needed to finish what he started. He returned to the leader and decapitated him. The protagonist decided that was it. It was time to return to the shelter. Now, its inhabitants were definitely safe and secure. Foraging forays should also be safer, in theory. He assumed Oda didn't need to know about what had happened, but everything Thomas had said turned out to be true. The protagonist understood that if he didn't decapitate the dead man in time, he would inevitably turn into a zombie, which led to the obvious conclusion that being bitten wasn't necessary for transformation. Simply dying was enough. He wondered if the military and Oda were aware of this. After all, both he and his subordinates were mercilessly shooting down any zombies they encountered. Even if the converted had previously been shelter residents, he'd never heard of them disposing of those who hadn't been bitten or wounded. That would be practically the same as shooting an innocent person. He assumed the military also avoided the unbitten. Therefore, the protagonist ventured to guess that none of them even knew about it. Another question: why then did the bandits possess such information? Probably because they killed people with sticks, both before and after the pandemic. He thought that in that case, everything fell into place, including what had happened at the base. He assumed it had happened like this. One of the survivors fell ill and then died in the middle of the night. After that, the newly formed undead slowly began to transform into a zombie. Then he attacked the others, causing them to become zombies as well. Since it happened at night, in the dark, the few survivors, especially those with poor eyesight, were slow to notice the oddities in the others' behavior. By the time they noticed, it was already too late. Most of those in the area had already been turned into zombies. The soldiers grabbed their weapons, but they couldn't bring themselves to open fire, as it turned out to be quite difficult to distinguish living people from zombies in a crowd. And if they had started shooting, they could have hit one of the survivors. Panic gripped the people. They ran out of the gym, only to find themselves in a huge swarm of zombies, where they were completely lost. No one could tell friend from foe, and against this backdrop, the people finally fell into despair. The protagonist, remembering the number of bullet casings lying along the road, no longer doubted that someone had lost their nerve and fired. In the midst of a firefight, bullets struck living people, which contributed to the emergence of new zombies, significantly worsening the situation. Therefore, it is not surprising that the military's next action was to leave the contaminated area as quickly as possible. They loaded the remaining survivors onto the ship and sailed off in search of a safer spot. The protagonist wasn't sure how accurate his assumption was, but it at least seemed plausible. After some thought, he finally decided to tell Oda what he'd learned. He'd lie, saying he'd read somewhere online that it wasn't just bitten people who turned into demons, but also those who simply died. He remembered the words about him being a monster, a beast. That's how those bandits spoke of him, frozen in horror. What was so special about that? Why should he suddenly care what all these scumbags thought of him? And yet, he couldn't get those words out of his head. They tugged at his heartstrings. He wondered what Oda, Kade, Yukinoshita, and everyone else would think if they knew about his power. The eyes of those bandits who looked at him with inhuman horror were frozen forever in his memory, like a photo. How would he feel if the people he loved suddenly looked at him with those same eyes? Would the day come when they would call him a monster? Safely returning to the shelter, the protagonist went to his room, changed clothes, and looked at his hands, which oozed magical power. He should not tell anyone about this power, and he should use it only in extreme cases, like when he was walking toward Kade, when the car broke down, when Thomas attacked Kade with ill intentions. Only in such moments, otherwise, he had to be extremely careful not to accidentally reveal himself. Embraced by darkness and loneliness, only the moonlight could he trust his secret. At that moment, there was a knock on his door, and Yukinoshita asked him if he was there. He told her he was there. The girl mentioned that Kade wanted to talk to him about something. The protagonist opened the door and invited them in. Kade turned to him shyly and asked if he was too busy right now. He told her everything was fine. The protagonist asked them if anything was wrong. Looking at how Yukinoshita supported the girl, MC thought that after that incident, his colleague had taken it upon herself to care for Kade, and now she always tried to be there for her. Yukinoshita said that their conversation would probably be personal, so she would leave them alone. She asked the protagonist to take her to her room as soon as they finished their conversation. She would be waiting there. Azami promised that he would do so. The girl turned to Kade and said that she didn't know if she would look strange if she said this, but everything would be fine. The protagonist is kind, he'll understand. The girl smiled at her and replied, okay. Yukinoshita said, then she's leaving. They'll see each other soon. She left, and Kade sat down across from the protagonist and fell silent. He asked her if something bad had happened. Kade told him she simply thought she hadn't had the chance to properly express her gratitude to him for what he'd done for her. He casually replied, if that's what she was asking, it's not worth it. It's such a small thing. She continued, this isn't the first time he's had to rescue her, and he can't even imagine how grateful she is. It's true. But at that moment, he was somehow strange, and even now, a little. In short, she'd like to tell him that she's a little afraid of him. The protagonist thought bitterly. Unfortunately, the reason for her fear was perfectly clear to him. She was talking about the moment when he had to attack Thomas. However, hearing this directly from her felt somehow unpleasant. Kade was silent for a moment, and then she hesitantly asked him if she could touch him. He was surprised by her question, but told her she could do whatever she wanted. Kade timidly approached him and placed her hand on his shoulder. Then, to the protagonist's surprise, she hugged him. He wanted to pull away, but she apologized, expressing how she could have thought of him that way. The girl pressed herself against him and continued. She herself didn't understand why she was so scared. After all, she had always treated him well. The protagonist asked her if he could stroke her head. Kade said she was still a little scared, but she thought if he did, her fear would disappear completely. He told her she didn't have to overcome herself at all. She firmly objected. No, she doesn't like to think of him in such a negative way. She felt disgusted by it. Instead of answering, he stroked her hair, and Kade fell silent. Suddenly, those men's words about him being a monster came back to him. Then he remembered Kade's words about her being afraid of him. He tensed at the memory. She sensed it and addressed him questioningly by name. The protagonist asked her, what's wrong? Kade answered that it was nothing. Everything was fine. She pulled away from him and said that she was fine now. Kade apologized to him for having to coddle her like that. The protagonist asked her if she was afraid of anything anymore. She told him that she wasn't. In that case, he is calm. The girl smiled and suggested that he do it again. He agreed and asked her if he could pet her head. Some time passed. Late at night, the protagonist infiltrated the gang's main headquarters, a shopping mall. It's no surprise that he was chosen. As it turned out, the building had an extremely convenient layout. The main entrance to the mall was located directly across from the parking lot. This allowed the gang members not only to leave the building unhindered, but also to barricade the doors with vans in case of a zombie attack. An inspection of the mall revealed that there were still quite a lot of supplies they needed, particularly food, left in the building. Every floor from the ground floor to the top was literally crammed with food. Moreover, the protagonist had recently heard from Oda that the cisterns near the police department were almost completely depleted of drinking water. And then Azami thought, if that were indeed the case, then why not get supplies here? The place was quite safe, and there was plenty of useful stuff here. After giving it some thought, MC came back the next day to tidy things up a bit. It took him some time to completely clear the building of zombies and the rabble that once called themselves members of a gang. After this, he set up barricades throughout the entire area, floors, stairs, and escalators, all the most vulnerable spots. Once that was done, he stocked up on food containers and stored them all on the second floor of the open parking lot. He thought it was a somewhat naive move, of course, but even if Oda and the others found it a little odd, it was unlikely to be enough to convince them otherwise. When he was finished, he looked around and thought, there's nothing more he can do here. If this helps the others in any way, then all his efforts will have been worthwhile. The next day, the protagonist, along with Oda and the others, arrived at the shopping mall. Having shown him everything he'd done the day before, he asked the captain what he thought about it. Oda looked everything over thoughtfully and said, the main entrance was securely barricaded. The back entrance also blocked with steel shutters. He noted that the parking lot was also cordoned off on all sides by vans. The captain added that, judging by all the outward signs, it looked as if someone had already occupied the space. The other replied, but perhaps that was just the impression. There was no evidence of life here. Baldy agreed with his partner. The protagonist thought, of course, he'd just cleaned up the place yesterday. Oda, after some consideration, finally agreed to try to get inside. MC told him that in that case, they'd better approach from the parking lot. There were definitely no zombies there. He added that he'd go first, and they should follow. Oda replied that he understood, but he felt very bad about being dragged into this. The captain said, he's practically begging him to be careful. The protagonist got into one of the cars in the parking lot and radioed his allies that the van keys were inside. He added that they seemed to still be running, so they should give it a try. Their plan was for the protagonist to start one of the vans and use it to help Oda and the others cross the parking lot. Then, using the same van, Azami was to block the entrance. Suddenly, Oda warned him that one infected had managed to get inside. MC reacted instantly and destroyed the zombie. The captain radioed him to stay focused. He must pay attention and keep his eyes open. The protagonist apologized and noted that, in any case, he hadn't encountered any zombies here yet. The protagonist thought that the captain had planned for them to alert the others if zombies infiltrated the area, and then work together to deal with them without leaving a safe distance. Did they really think he'd let them do that? Magic or not, if he could handle something on his own, he wouldn't resort to anyone's help. It would be much better for both his safety and the safety of the others. When Azami gave everyone the all-clear, the police officers climbed up to the second floor. They informed the captain that there were boxes of supplies on the second floor of the parking lot. Oda replied that that wasn't a bad idea, but they should first try to inspect the shopping center. He added that he was still skeptical. What if someone was there in the inner rooms? What if those supplies belonged to someone? Then they simply had no right to just take them. Besides, they didn't need any additional trouble. He gave the order for everyone to spread out around the entire perimeter and to look into every corner to search carefully. The police reported to him that they would carry out everything precisely. The protagonist thought, what a good speech. And where did he come from? So correct. Sometime later, when the police officers inspected the shopping center, Oda said in bewilderment, it seemed there was no one here, neither people nor zombies. But then, why was this building so well protected? Someone had done a good job of this. The bald man suggested, maybe they were the military, and in general, was it possible that all these boxes of supplies belonged to them? The captain said it was unlikely, but in this world, anything was possible. It seemed they mentioned that their base was located somewhere nearby. Oda turned to the protagonist and asked him what he thought about it. Azami replied that he didn't even know, but he, a police captain, probably understood all this better than he did. Oda noticed that's how it was. Well, they wouldn't be able to cover the entire shopping center in one day anyway, so perhaps they could call it a day. He ordered his subordinates to load all the supplies they'd found in the parking lot into the back of the truck, and they'd be leaving. The protagonist also actively joined in loading the provisions. He noticed the captain writing something and asked him what he was doing. Oda replied that he was writing a note, apologizing to the potential owners of the provisions for having to borrow a little. If they needed anything, he'd written down how to contact him. Oda added that he'd leave this note just in case anyone missed the supplies. He added that time was running out now. They wouldn't be back here tomorrow. If they managed to find out that this building was truly unused, they'd shop here for a while. Continuing to load the provisions, the protagonist thought no one had dared to oppose the captain's decision. So, with a combined effort, they continued loading everything they had found. Thanks to the freedom of movement, the location, surprisingly, turned out to be very convenient. They were able to finish everything without panic or rush. At the sight of the truck's full body, genuine joy lit up the tired faces of the police officers. The protagonist thought it might even be for the best that they hadn't managed to inspect everything today. After all, now he had a whole day to secretly smuggle even more supplies into the shopping center. Sometime later, when the allies had safely returned, Oda gathered everyone in his office. He told them to listen carefully. He had gathered them here to discuss their latest foray. The captain added that he wanted to hear their honest opinions on everything that had happened today. After a while, Yukinoshita stretched and said, they're moving to a new place. I hope there's at least some clothes left there. The protagonist replied that there was plenty of that stuff there. His colleague exclaimed happily, is that true? The protagonist confirmed it was. He added that there used to be a shopping mall in this spot, and many stores rented space there. Yukinoshita had probably been there before, right? He noticed Kade was sad. The MC asked her if something was wrong. She asked him, what kind of place is this? The protagonist replied that it looked quite safe. She had nothing to worry about. He added that Oda thought so too. And besides, there were plenty of provisions there. They'll be able to hide inside for a while, and they won't even have to venture above ground. Kade visibly brightened and said, well, then that's good. The protagonist noted that she didn't seem to have calmed down. Yukinoshita stroked her head and told her to trust Oda and his team, and everything will be fine. Kade agreed. Azami calmly told Kade not to worry so much. He'll help too, if anything happens. Yukinoshita said they knew that, but Kade was worried not only about herself, but about him as well, so he should try to stay out of trouble. The protagonist replied that they'd convinced him. He'd take care of himself. A little later, the protagonist told Oda about this. The captain said thoughtfully, I see. This won't work. All this worrying isn't in their favor. He added that the advantages of moving to a new shelter far outweighed the disadvantages. He suggested waiting until the unrest had died down before taking action. They would certainly try. So, after lengthy discussions, Oda gathered all the survivors and the police in the main hall to announce the move. They were given exactly 1 day to pack. They were supposed to leave the next. They spent most of the time debating what to take and how to pack it all efficiently. Oda, observing all this, noted, packing, rechecking the shopping center for security, delivering provisions. He felt like this day would never end. The protagonist agreed. The captain continued, saying that when night fell, they would stop all work and rest a bit. They couldn't work themselves to exhaustion. The protagonist remarked that they would transport all the survivors and then they could do whatever they wanted with him. He looked at the surprised captain and asked him, what did he think? He'd be with them until the very end. Oda thanked him profusely, adding that he was helping them immensely. A day later, having stowed the last of their weapons in the van, everyone set off for the new location. Yukinoshita supported the anxious Kade as best she could. The transportation of the police squad, the survivors, the women and children, and all their belongings to the new location was finally complete. Then Oda, the police squad, and the protagonist walked around the mall again, and having confirmed that everything was in order, wrapped up all work until the morning. Only now did the protagonist notice that there were significantly fewer men among the survivors, including the police. So much so that he and Oda felt a little uneasy. Overcoming this feeling, they headed for the cells. Azami asked Oda if it was really necessary to take him along. The captain answered that everyone had different opinions, but overall, it would probably be necessary. Thomas spoke in confusion. Did they remember to ask him? The protagonist snapped at him, telling him to keep quiet. The boy stuttered in fear and crawled away from the bars. The protagonist asked Oda how he could possibly be of any use to them. He was nothing but trouble. The captain said he understood what MC wanted to tell him, which was why he hesitated. The protagonist asked him if it was worth it. The precinct chief said that leaving him here, especially without protective equipment, would be like abandoning a man to his fate. They couldn't even provide him with weapons from their reserves. The protagonist irritably remarked, so they should just leave him here to die. He attacked Kade and even tried to kill her. Was he, as a representative of the authorities, sure they needed such a scumbag in the shelter? Thomas looked at him with fear and hope in his eyes. Oda was about to say something to MC, but he stopped him, declaring that he held him in the highest regard. However, in this situation, he couldn't support his decision. He personally was against taking this guy along. It was too much of a risk for them. The captain said he understood. The protagonist spoke sharply, yet he told him he was hesitant. However, judging by his words, he wasn't even considering leaving this bastard here, even though they should have. Oda pointed out that, on the one hand, he was right. The food supply wasn't endless, and besides, he could very well do something again, so they'd have to assign him a guard. Yes, the protagonist was right. Taking him along was a great risk for them all, and yet they couldn't abandon him here. Thomas hung on their every word, hoping for his own salvation. The protagonist snapped that he had heard enough. Oda looked at him in surprise. He'd never heard an ally use that tone before. MC pulled out his pistol, covered the captain's hand so he couldn't interfere, and was about to shoot Thomas. The boy looked at him with resignation. Oda shouted, "Don't do this," but the protagonist, regardless, shot the bastard. Thomas, perplexed as to why this had happened to him, fell to the floor and died. The protagonist answered, "Why?" Clearly, it was retribution for his actions. At that moment, Oda's subordinates came running at the sound of the gunshot. They asked the captain in bewilderment, what was all the noise? What had happened? The precinct chief, in disbelief, tried to tell the protagonist something. Azami remarked, well, now they won't have to make that difficult decision themselves. The police officers simply froze, realizing what had happened, and decided not to interfere for now. A little later, after the incident, the protagonist sat on the floor, thinking. Looking back now, he believed he'd made the right decision. Oda must have realized this too, since he'd spared him the responsibility, and he wouldn't even have to throw anyone out. People with bad intentions do far more harm than, say, zombies. He'd been convinced of this during his time in the other world, and recent events had only reinforced it. Such scum should be disposed of immediately. The protagonist looked at his hand. Had he made a mistake? How would the others react to his actions? Somehow, he was sure they wouldn't judge him. He'd done nothing wrong. and even if his conscience suddenly awakened, he wouldn't change his mind. As always, he only did what he had to. When it was all over, they were able to safely move to a new location. Upon learning of the incident, the others said nothing terrible had happened, but they'd get more food, and that was how it was settled. Yukinoshita angrily told the protagonist he'd been gone for a while. She and Kade were starting to worry about him, wondering if something had happened. The protagonist told her there had been some complications, and he had to deal with them, and besides, it had started raining. Kade smiled, but it was still great that he'd made it here without incident. He said, "That's true. It's good that they'd made it here without any problems." The allies were silent for a moment. Then Yukinoshita suggested that Kade look around, now that their move was complete. She turned to the MC and told him they were inviting him too, and that was non-negotiable. Kade laughed and said she'd be happy to. The protagonist also saw no problem in coming along. Yukinoshita excitedly hugged Kade and exclaimed, "Finally, shopping." They were going shopping, and all together, they set off to look for something, including clothes. After a while, Oda asked the protagonist why he'd done what he'd done. The protagonist replied that he'd only done what he thought was right. The captain asked him distantly, did he do it just because he'd attacked Kade? Wasn't that the deciding factor? Azami noted that that moment had played a role too, but he didn't think the guy deserved to live. Oda asked, really? The protagonist spoke with anger, but he'd hesitated too, hadn't he? He'd simply helped him make the right decision. The captain countered. He might have understood if he'd shot him out of anger, or simply lost his temper. But from his words, it was clear he had no regrets. It was as if he didn't care what he'd done. Azami told him he was right. It had been a deliberate and considered decision, and he decided it was better to kill him. Oda was shocked by his answer and asked him, perplexed, where did this indifference come from? Why did he become like this? The protagonist replied that such worthless people should be disposed of immediately. That's all. The captain looked at him thoughtfully and asked if he had ever killed anyone before. The protagonist answered honestly to this question as well. Yes, he had, and a lot. Oda looked at him incredulously. He was joking, right? Azami calmly replied that it was true. He added that therefore, he, the captain, would no longer have to torment himself with the choice of whether or not to kill. He would do it for him. Oda wondered if he could ask why. Although, he didn't know if it would change anything. He didn't understand. Was he missing something? The MC asked him if he wanted to know the reason. For the most part, he killed only in self-defense, but there were certain exceptions, like with that guy. For example, someone was bothering him, and someone was a threat. Those he killed for these reasons had also done great harm. And then the protagonist simply couldn't stop. He talked and talked and talked, as if this very question had touched those strings of his soul that he had tried to hide until now. He didn't yet know how wrong he had been in doing this, but he didn't want to lie to everyone anymore. After he finished his speech, Oda asked him in a stern voice, what would he do if something like this happened again? The protagonist grimly replied that next time he wouldn't hold back. He would kill without hesitation. The captain said thoughtfully, I see. He paused for a moment, and then told the protagonist in a decisive tone that in that case, he would have to exile him. The protagonist hadn't expected such a turn of events. He spoke with bewilderment. That's how it is. He thought about killing those who stood in his way, getting rid of unnecessary people. His ideology differed from what the world had accepted before, what it had now. But some people had accepted it and now lived among the rest. Oda could have been one of them, but instead, he chose to lead a crowd of those who disagreed. The bald man exclaimed in bewilderment. Was it really the right thing to do? Just kill him like that. Azami said it was perfectly true. He did it for Kade and Yukinoshita. Oda had said something important when they first met. A person must be responsible for his actions, and he tries to keep his word. The protagonist looked at him and thought, remembering a long time ago, searching for refuge for Kade, wandering the empty streets, not knowing where to go. In the end, he returned to her empty-handed. Even back then, he had considered this shopping mall as an option. There's plenty of food there, and even if something suddenly runs out, he can always search nearby. It's safer than just hanging around the streets. And the soldiers, if they managed to survive, would be able to find them there more easily. And now he thought Yukinoshita would be furious. He told Oda, sitting next to him behind the wheel of the car, that he was saying the right thing. Let everyone think he died during the fight with the infected. The bald man looked at him in surprise. The captain told him that only 4 people knew about what happened last night. He wasn't going to report it to the others. So, he thought this would be the best option. The bald man continued to look at the protagonist as if he were seeing him for the first time. Azami said, Mr. Captain, in his element. Early the next morning, while everyone was still asleep, they left the shelter under the pretext of inspecting the remaining provisions. Some of them were planned to be transported to the main building, and immediately after that, the protagonist was supposed to leave. While Oda's subordinates and the protagonist were loading the truck, the bald man's radio went off. The captain said, Here come the guests. He told his allies to quickly pack up and jump in the van. Several infected were advancing on them. When the bald man and the other man were in the back, the protagonist remained below. They looked at him in surprise. Then the other man said, So that's what he decided. The bald man exclaimed, Now's not the time. It's dangerous out there. Let him jump in with them. The protagonist told them he was happy to work with them. He also asked them to take care of Kade and Yukinoshita and to say hello to Oda. Turning around after these words, he wandered off alone down the street. The captain's subordinates watched him for a long time. The next morning, Yukinoshita met Kade near the MC's room. She greeted the girl and remarked that she was up early today. Kade wished her ally a good morning. Yukinoshita remarked that she hadn't expected to see her near her mentor's room. Does she have some business with him? The girls knocked on the protagonist's door, but no one answered. Then they opened his door and were surprised to find it empty. Yukinoshita noted with confusion. He was already up. I wonder where he'd gone? Kade's expression suddenly changed and she ran down the hallway. Yukinoshita called out to her in confusion, but the girl didn't answer. She kept running. Along the way, she encountered a policewoman. Kade apologized to her and asked if she knew where Mr. Azami was. The woman wished her good morning and told her that he and Oda had gone on a mission. They said they needed to pick up something from the police station and, apparently, also check their supplies. Kade, calming down, said, I see. She apologized to the woman for stopping her so abruptly. At that moment, Yukinoshita called out to her, ran up to the girl, and told her she'd startled her. Where had she run off to so suddenly? The policewoman wished her good morning too, remarking that they were always so friendly. It was nice to see them. Yukinoshita hugged Kade and told the woman that their girl simply liked the protagonist, that she was crazy about him. Kade was indignant. What was she saying? Nothing of the sort. Yukinoshita was playfully teasing her. After a while, Kade decided to tidy up the protagonist's room. Her attention was drawn to his backpack lying on the floor. At that moment, Yukinoshita entered the door and told her that Oda and his group had returned, and it seemed they were having some kind of conversation. When the girls went downstairs, the remaining survivors were already there, along with Oda and his subordinates. Kade looked at everyone and anxiously asked them where the protagonist was. The captain asked for everyone's attention. He had an important announcement. The protagonist's allies froze in anxious anticipation. When Oda told them everything, Kade felt as if thunder had struck her, and the atmosphere around her had changed. She exclaimed in disbelief, "What did he just say? What happened to MC?" Yukinoshita's legs buckled. She sank to the floor and bit her fist to keep from bursting into tears. Kade looked at everyone distantly and said, "This can't be happening. It simply can't be true." Unable to bear the tension, she too sank to the floor. Yukinoshita finally couldn't hold back her tears, declaring that she didn't want to believe it. She simply couldn't believe it. Everyone else stood in shocked silence. Kade spoke again, but not him. Meanwhile, the protagonist had arrived at the place where he and Kade had first met. Entering the building, weapon at the ready, he reflected on how long it had been since he'd been here. Approaching one of the doors, he paused and remembered how she'd asked him to stroke her head that day, but he'd never fulfilled her request. Frozen in indecision, he finally opened the door. Katie's mother lay on the floor, just as before. The protagonist looked at her and said, "I've sent her daughter to safety. She has nothing to worry about. Let her sleep peacefully." Then, he wondered, perplexed, or was it not her? He left the room and closed the door behind him. He decided that since he was alone, he had nothing to fear, and he decided to take action. He destroyed the infected wherever he found them. Several days had passed since then. It was enough to completely freeze his heart. Sadness, loneliness, pain, all these feelings, he suddenly forgot about them. They no longer meant anything to him. From now on, all he saw before him were hordes of hungry zombies. Initially, he had planned to clear the area near the shopping center, at least to ensure the safety of its inhabitants from a distance. However, the more often he encountered zombies on his way there, the more anger he felt toward them and the world in general. Then the protagonist stopped by their old shelter and walked through its floors. Perhaps Oda would want to return here for something else. He needed to clean up here too. He never considered his decision unfair and never doubted it for a second. The protagonist bore no resentment or anger toward him. After all, even after everything that had happened, he still respected the captain, and he was always ready to do so. Having cleared the shelter of the infected, he thought with satisfaction that it was much calmer now. He had done all he could for them. They no longer needed him. The very thought of this suddenly made his heart ache. He realized that by killing zombies over and over again, he had been trying to forget. After some time, Kade told Yukinoshita that it might seem strange, but she thought Azami was still alive. Surprised, Kade asked her where she got that idea from. Kade replied, it was just her intuition. She added that besides, when they met at the hardware store, it was clear this wasn't his first time going out alone. And wasn't it odd that the infected killed him, not Oda or the other police officers? Shocked, Yukinoshita hugged her and said, maybe she's right. Kade looked at her and asked if she knew anything. Confused, Yukinoshita asked her what she was talking about. Kade told her that it didn't matter anymore. She wished the girl good night and lay down on the bed. Yukinoshita wished her sweet dreams too. Kade tried to fall asleep, but heavy thoughts kept her from doing so, and she simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about something else. Meanwhile, the protagonist aimlessly killed zombies every day. He thought, and all this wasn't for a noble purpose, like saving the survivors. If anyone remained alive, it would only be for their own good. He killed every zombie he encountered, but that didn't guarantee that Oda and the others would reach their hideout. Walking through the city at night, he noticed that after the densely populated area, he rarely felt anyone's gaze on him. And if he did, it seemed to him that they were survivors or entire shelters, but he wouldn't get involved in that now. He thought, It wasn't that he cared about human contact, otherwise he would be on his knees, begging Oda to let him stay. It's not that he wanted to save people, otherwise he'd cut down zombies with all his might, without a second thought. It's not that everyone he saved was good, but if they turned out to be villains, his value system wouldn't allow those scumbags to live. Still, he wouldn't want to find himself in such a nasty situation again, where he'd have to lie and abandon those who cared about him. This applies to the situation with Oda and his allies. Thus, wandering aimlessly through the city, the protagonist was surprised to notice that it was morning. The rising sun blinded the streets, mercilessly revealing mountains of zombie bodies. The protagonist approached a shuttered store and forcibly broke the door lock. Entering and looking around, the protagonist thought that there must have been a cafe here before. There were tables and chairs everywhere, and there was also a bar counter. He looked around again and noted how many zombies there were. After clearing the area, he piled their bodies into one pile. Then he retrieved his backpack from storage, propped it up under his head, and lay down, noting that now he only had to waste time until nightfall. Suddenly, an image of the establishment's kitchen area flashed through his mind, and he sensed the presence of two living people surrounded by zombies. Momo cursed and asked Hina what they should do. The protagonist wondered if these people sounded like youngsters, or even children. He jumped up, wondering if he would have to take responsibility for them later, like he had with Kade. The protagonist realized where the sounds and voices were coming from, and rushed in that direction. He saw the zombies advancing on a young man and woman who were holding only bats. Hina shielded Momo with his arm, keeping his bat at the ready. The infected were inexorably approaching them. The protagonist opened the shuttered door slightly and shouted at them to come to him. They had to hurry up and come to him. The boy and girl stared at him in amazement. The MC rushed forward, fighting off the zombies. He shouted at them to hurry. The young people didn't hesitate any longer. They rushed to the saving door. Azami, having destroyed the nearby zombies, jumped in after them and shouted at Hina to close the door. They all made it just in time. The crowd of zombies was trying to attack the already closed door. Hina apologized to the protagonist and thanked him for his help. He added that the protagonist had saved them. The MC asked them if they were injured. The boy replied that they were fine. He turned to his companion and asked, "What about her?" The girl replied that she was fine too. She looked warily at the protagonist and also thanked him. Azami told them that the three of them had better leave quickly, as zombies might break down the shutters soon. Hina and Momo became wary and raised their bats. The protagonist looked at them and asked if this was the only weapon they had. They sheepishly replied that it was. MC pulled a pistol from his backpack and handed it to the boy. The protagonist noticed that the young men looked back and forth between the weapon and him in amazement. He supposed it was a natural reaction to a gun, and it seemed they were now more hostile toward him. He understood it was hard to take that from the man who had helped them, but there was nothing he could do about it. The protagonist turned to the boy and told him he'd give him one. Did he know how to use it? Just in case, MC explained to him that he needed to load the magazine with bullets and fire. If a critical situation arose, he should just fire, and he should try to handle it with extreme caution. Hina hesitantly picked up the gun and began examining it. Then he looked at the protagonist more kindly. The protagonist, observing their surprised expressions, asked them, "What?" He noted that the boy was still cautious around him, but not as much as he had initially been. Hina thanked him and added that he had been a great help. The protagonist looked at Momo and noted that the girl was still hostile toward him. Momo, indeed, kept her wary gaze fixed on the protagonist. Azami said, "No need for thanks. After all, there were still zombies outside, so it didn't matter." He thought, but as long as they were here, everything would be fine. He glanced at the shutters and confirmed that they were completely closed and showed no signs of damage. Judging by the auras, the zombies were gradually scattering. If they went outside now, they would definitely become their meal. The boy timidly said his name and introduced his companion to the protagonist. The girl also gave her full name. The MC looked at them, noting that since he'd helped them in that situation, he'd have to take responsibility for their safety. The question was how far he could go with them. He told them his name in return and said they could call him whatever they wanted. Having calmed down a bit, Hina asked the protagonist how he'd ended up here. Azami told him he'd just been wandering aimlessly around the city and had stumbled here by accident. And what about them? How did they end up here? Hina said they'd simply wandered here. He wondered if the protagonist was traveling alone. The MC remarked something like that. And where were they from? The boy told him they used to live in a shelter, but there'd been a zombie attack and they'd had to flee. Thus, from Hina's story, the protagonist learned that the evacuation center was a school, and it was quite fortified. However, over time, the situation became tense due to food shortages, and internal order began to collapse. To make matters worse, an infected person infiltrated the school grounds, resulting in the deaths of many people. The protagonist thought that, judging by everything, they hadn't seen their parents since the beginning of the incident. He said he understood everything. He expressed regret that Hina had to remember all of this. The boy didn't argue. It had been very difficult to go through. MC noted that, in any case, they weren't in a hurry, were they? Momo and Hina responded that they were. The protagonist suggested that they stay here until things calmed down. He added that he had saved them, and he didn't want them to die as soon as they went outside. Hina paused, then thanked the protagonist again. He didn't know how else to thank him. The protagonist told him not to worry about it, Azami asked them how old they were. The guy said they were middle school students, 16 years old, so what was wrong? The protagonist noted nothing, he was just asking. Hina turned to him and said he had a small favor to ask. Could he help them? The protagonist thought for a moment and then said he agreed to it. He told them he needed to take them to some safe place, or rather, he knew where it was, and he was sure it would suit them too. Hina said that when the phones were still working, they were able to communicate with Momo's parents. This village is quite far from the city, and the girl's grandfather lives there. He runs a dojo, and also, in this place, there are a lot of steps. And he also said that many villagers evacuated there. He asked the protagonist what he thought about this. Could he take them there? MC replied that he understood, but he had one condition for them. The boy asked him in surprise, "What is it?" Azami said he would tell them, and they silently complied. He noted that as soon as he said this, Hina and Momo became wary. After a brief silence, the boys said they agreed to it. The protagonist noted, "Excellent. But first, he needed to get a car, and they could rest for now." Momo continued to stare at him warily. The protagonist turned to leave. Hina wanted to ask him something, but the protagonist said that they were not to go outside under any circumstances. After a while, Azami returned with the car, and the three of them set off. Hina, surprised, asked him how he had managed to get transportation. MC replied that the car was parked outside, and he had simply borrowed it. He added, and anyway, Hina, wanted to get to a place that is so far away without a car? The boy was embarrassed. Of course, he hadn't thought about that. A short time later, the protagonist asked Hina if they'd ever wanted to find a community where people could come together. The boy remarked that he'd sometimes thought about it. They drove in silence for a while. The protagonist glanced in the rearview mirror and, pointing to a backpack between his allies, told them there was food there. If they were hungry, they could take it. For most of the journey, there was deathly silence. Hina and Momo also didn't touch the food. Parking near a hotel, the protagonist neutralized the infected and told his companions that they would be staying there for the night. He added that they were to stay close to him and not leave this place on their own. Entering the building, Hina admiringly told the protagonist that he was amazing. He dealt with the infected all by himself. Aren't you afraid of getting infected by these people? The protagonist answered calmly, saying he was already used to chopping off their heads. The boy asked in amazement, already used to it? The protagonist grinned and asked Hina if he wasn't the same. He killed many zombies to survive, didn't he? Hina admitted he was absolutely right, but they still scared him. He added that if the protagonist hadn't saved them today, he and Momo would already be dead. MC muttered, they were just lucky. He looked at the boy carefully and said that they would continue their journey tomorrow at dawn, but for now, they needed to get some rest. Hina asked him what about himself. Azami said he would be in the next room, as he was curious about what was going on outside. He looked at his worried companions and remarked that they shouldn't worry about such things. They should simply recuperate before the journey. Azami pulled back the curtain to look out the window when he heard the door creak and Hina standing there. He asked what was wrong. Hina apologized, wanting to talk to him, and then thanked him for everything he'd done. Momo was also incredibly grateful. Azami pointed out that they still hadn't reached their destination yet, and when they were safe, they would thank him, and next time he wanted to hear it from her. Hina awkwardly apologized, but the protagonist interrupted him and said he was joking. Was that all he wanted to say? Hina added that what he wanted to say didn't apply to Momo. Had he ever killed a normal person, not an infected person? The protagonist looked at him and said that had happened. Hina asked what he was thinking then. He replied, "Don't talk about it. It happened, and he wasn't thinking about anything. He killed because he thought it was necessary, and that was all." Hina was surprised and remarked that he really is incredible. The MC, perplexed, asked why. Hina said he hadn't been thinking clearly and had killed as well. The two of them hid for a while, then decided to change locations and stumbled upon a group of people. Afterward, the group tried to kidnap Momo, but at that moment, Hina entered the room, grabbed a gun, and killed them. He said that at that moment, he had a gun in his hand, which he found while he was with Momo. Azami remarked that he had no choice and that it was necessary, so he killed. On the contrary, he tried hard and been prepared for this, so he'd made the right decision. Hina chuckled awkwardly, praising him for killing people felt somehow wrong. The protagonist said the world would never be the same again, so it was okay. It wasn't like he'd enjoy killing. Hina agreed, and it only made him feel better. The protagonist added, however, that he didn't understand one thing. He should be wary of strangers, so why is he with him now? Hina wondered if he hadn't given him the gun. He'd immediately thought he could trust him. He asked, was it just because of that? Hina said, and although he'd helped them, they could always leave later. But he'd gone after the car alone, and then he'd protected them again. He'd recently dealt with the infected too, and even after everything that had happened, Momo still didn't trust him. But he thought she'd open up to him with time. MC asked, did he mean to say he trusted him completely? Hina agreed, so he gave it back and apologized for lying to him earlier. Azami stopped him and asked, didn't they share the same gun? So he could give it to Momo, but he had to make sure she was careful with it. Hina clutched the gun in his hand and added, as he thought he was someone he could trust. The protagonist thought about how when he confessed to Oda about the murder, he had exiled him, and now it was the other way around, and he couldn't believe he'd earned his trust that way. Meanwhile, as dawn broke, the car headed along the empty highway. According to the protagonist, he had helped them anyway, which meant he was still responsible. He would protect them until they were safe, just like he had with Kade. When they reached the town, the first thing he saw were corpses with their heads split open. More likely, they were cleaved than split. Hina asked if Suzukake had done this. Azami asked if Momo's grandfather had done it. He asked them not to stray too far from him, and began climbing along staircase. According to the protagonist, a rope was stretched between the trees along the staircase, obviously an attempt to stop the zombies, and for several minutes, he had felt someone's eyes on him. He ordered everyone to stop, when suddenly he noticed a villager in front of him, pointing a gun at him. He asked if they were from this town. The protagonist asked if Suzukake was here. He had only brought Hina and Momo. The resident happily asked, Hina and Momo? The MC asked if they knew each other. Hina agreed, and he thought that the man was no longer so hostile, and it seemed the goal had been achieved. Suzukake happily hugged Momo, and she awkwardly said that he was too noisy. He tearfully asked, so what if he was noisy? He was so glad that she was okay. Hina was also safe. Momo broke free from his embrace and hit her back against Azami, awkwardly apologizing. He asked if she should openly rejoice. Momo thought for a moment and saw the protagonist start to leave. She asked where he was going. The MC replied that it was safe here, so they no longer needed him. Hina called out to him. Didn't he plan to stay here too? The protagonist said that he had simply brought the two of them here. Momo frustratedly asked him to wait, as she hadn't thanked him yet. The protagonist smiled, and she asked, perplexed, why he was smiling. Suzukake asked if he had somewhere to go. He replied that he didn't really, and offered to stay here or at least let him thank him. In a world like this, they had nowhere to rush, right? It was fine. He brought them both here, so he didn't have to rush. MC looked around and noticed men with guns. After a while, they were sitting at the table, and Suzukake remarked that Hina's parents had also had a hard time, but they were both safe, and that was good. Hina turned to Azami and said that he'd helped them out tremendously, and that they wouldn't have been able to get here without him. Suzukake bowed and added that he was so grateful. The protagonist asked him to look up. He'd just helped. Hina called out to Suzukake and said that MC was amazing, and that the infected didn't scare him at all. Azami asked if they were the ones who cut out the infected in the city. Suzukake said that every few days the townspeople clear out all the infected who come in, so he wasn't the only one doing it, but if that cut was good, it could have been him. The protagonist thought about it. It didn't look like there were that many people here, and he said that the locals were scattered and evacuated to schools and other large buildings. Where was Hina? He went to the training hall, and it seemed his grandfather was holding a class for him. Momo asked if he was coming too. Azami was about to refuse, when she suddenly nudged him in the back and cheerfully asked him to come with her. Meanwhile, Hina and Suzukake were sitting across from each other. The protagonist said he came to watch, but it seemed they were already done. Suzukake apologized, and they quickly finished their morning class. Maybe he could try it too? Hina kept telling him how he handled himself in battle. Would he risk it? The MC remarked that he didn't want to risk it and accidentally injure him. Suzukake remarked that he'd hurt him and that no matter what he said, he didn't care about his injuries. Azami asked why he was doing this. Suzukake asked if Hina wanted to watch. Momo exclaimed happily. She also wanted to see her grandfather lose. Suzukake exclaimed in bewilderment. Now he had nowhere to go. He had no chance. After that, they came into the room, and the old man asked if he didn't mind. They didn't open the bottle only because they were saving it for better times. The protagonist apologized. He didn't know much about alcohol. Suzukake asked, does that mean he doesn't drink it at all? He was just about the right age to try the tasty liquor. He poured him some and, after tasting it, declared it delicious. Suzukake added happily, he told you so. The protagonist asked why he'd called him. Did he want to talk about Hina? Suzukake remarked. Then they'll start with him. They're saying Hina killed someone that morning. MC asked if that's what he thought, and what did he tell him? He replied that he did it to save his sweet granddaughter, so he didn't say anything. Scolding him was useless, but he didn't even thank him. Should he have been thanked for killing a man to save Momo? If only he'd forced him to admit his guilt, but he didn't. He had no idea what he should have said. Azami said he could sympathize with him, and that he should know that she supported Hin herself, so he thought he did the right thing. What did he think? Suzukake added that he understood perfectly well that sometimes there are hopeless situations, but he was still a child, and that's why he didn't want this outcome. The protagonist said he didn't know if it was appropriate to say this, but he felt that in today's world, even the concept of a child had changed. At Hin's age, many people leave their parents and become adventurers, and it was the same in another world. It might sound strange, but he had to support him. He's sure Hina is still tormented by his actions, and whether killing someone was right or wrong doesn't matter. He still believes he acted justly though, but his support will make his life a little easier, and Momo's too. Suzukake smiled and said he was so kind. MC replied that he was mistaken and would tell him in advance that he only brought them here because he had to save them and felt a certain responsibility for them, precisely because he saved them. Suzukake pointed out that this was kindness, but he understood and would talk to Hina again. Azami ate his snack and asked if he wanted anything else, right? Suzukake hesitantly said that it was hard for him to ask such a thing, but he was asking him to leave their territory. Of course, they themselves had told him not to rush, and he knew he sounded completely selfish. Suddenly, the protagonist grinned and apologized, his expression making him worry. He was about to leave anyway. Did he remember how he almost said goodbye after bringing the guys home? So he shouldn't worry. Suzukake sighed heavily and added, but he was the one holding him back. MC asked if he'd tell them why they were kicking him out. He agreed. A gang had once come to their town, and at first he thought they were just people who'd fled a larger city to escape the infected. But they weren't refugees at all. They were bandits. When one of their shelters was destroyed, they decided to do something terrible and started killing them. But after many wars, they forced them to flee the city. And from then on, they decided not to accept outsiders into their land. The protagonist asked, so why did he tell him to stay? Suzukake replied, what's he even asking? Because he brought his granddaughter home. Both Momo and Hina wanted him to stay. They couldn't just say goodbye, and he understood why they liked him. He himself didn't care when he left, but his will wasn't the will of the entire town.